Thank you everyone for joining. It is my pleasure to open the 12th meeting of the Spatial Productivity Lab. It is organized together with our partners, Productivity Insights Network. My name is Alexandra Tsvetkova. I'm economist and policy analyst at the OECD Trento Centre, where I manage activities of the Spatial Productivity Lab. Before we go in the main program, I would like to invite representatives of the two organizing parties, the OECD and Productivity Insights Network, for welcome remarks. I would like to invite Nadim Ahmad, who is Deputy Director of the Center for Entrepreneurship, SMEs, Regions and Cities here at the OECD, to offer his welcome. Nadim, the floor is yours.
Sorry about that. I just had to get myself on mute. So let me begin by saying how delighted I am to be here with you today, and to thank all of you for joining us at this 12th meeting of the Spatial Productivity Lab. I'd like to say a special thank you to our partners, the Productivity Insights Network, for co-organizing this event, and also for the active participation that I'm sure that will take place during the meeting. And now we've got a very busy agenda, so I'm going to be quite short in my introductory remarks, but because there are quite a few new faces amongst us today, I thought I'd take the opportunity of just framing some of the importance of the lab within the broader context of the work that we undertake within the OECD Centre for Entrepreneurship, SMEs, Regions and Cities. It's a bit of a mouthful, CFE for short. Then where we bring a strong place, people and firm-based approach to the OECD's broader goal of better policies for better lives. Now, I don't need to tell you who are here today that productivity, of course, underpins our ability to deliver on that goal. And the role of the lab really is to emphasize the importance of places in the productivity discourse. It's an emphasis that recognizes that spatial disparities in productivity are often larger within countries than they are across them. And there's spatial disparities that are driven, as our work on regions and cities shows. And I certainly encourage you to read the report, the most recent publication, Regions, Cities at a Glance. Those disparities driven by factors of production, such as skills and capital, including digital connectivity, access to finance, agglomeration effects, access to markets, but also spatial disparities in governance structures. And we've done a lot of work looking at those issues too. Now, historically, too little of the discourse around productivity has recognized this place-based dimension when we think about productivity. But the lab and events such as today are helping to change that. And we have a much better understanding now that when we consider challenges and megatrends such as globalization, digitalization, aging, depopulation, climate change, and indeed many of those that COVID-19 has accelerated, for example, digital teleworking, we also need to strongly recognize the importance of places in that discussion. And I guess that the current crisis also ensure that today, when we think about productivity, we also need to ensure that we mean resilient, inclusive, and sustainable productivity. And this, to some extent, is not unlike the legacies that we had from the financial crisis, where we saw the shift in short-termism towards long-termism in the way that we think about managing the economy. So all of these dimensions and all of these factors have a very strong place-based dimension, and we need to try to make sure that we can mainstream all of that thinking as we move forward. And part of that, I guess, reflects the importance of making sure that we factor in negative externalities from unsustainable growth, because these also have a very strong spatial impact. You know, for example, in terms of pollutants that impact on local health, or indeed on the local environment, you know, emissions, for example, into local rivers. And these all have very strong place-based dimensions. And I'm minded, and I'm sure that our UK partners are very well aware of this, of the Dasgupta report, which only came out this week, which called for economic measures that factored in these negative externalities, because if we want to be sustainable, we need to start having different types of metrics that capture in these negative externalities. Too much of the productivity discourse ignores the use of natural capital, and also the negative externalities that come through from basically different production techniques. And I'm confident that the lab, and indeed today's event, I think, will help deliver on the evidence base that we need to drive forward on that really important agenda. And so with that, I think I can go on for an awful long time, but with that, I will leave it and pass the floor back to you, Alexandra, and look forward to a very, very lively and an interesting discussion. So thank you.
Thank you, Nadim. I can second, I think, every word. Right now, I would like to invite Tim Worley, who is Pro Vice Chancellor and Dean of Oxford Brookes Business School in the Great Britain, but he also is co-director of the Productivity Insights Network. Tim, I would like to thank you for all the work that you and Philippe put into making this event happen. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and thank you to Dean for the introduction. I think it's been great working with the OECD as partners on the Productivity Insights, and we're particularly grateful for Joachim, who sits on our advisory board and has done for the last 3 years. Just before we hand over to the main event, I'd just like to say a few words about the Productivity Insights Network, and I have a couple of slides just to share some information for those that may not be familiar with who we are and what we've been doing over the last couple of years. So if we could just move on, please. So the Productivity Insights Network, as the name suggests, is really there to try and challenge thinking around productivity and bring a real interdisciplinary perspective. Since we were established in 2018, we've undertaken a series of projects through the thematic areas that you can see on the slide there, and really trying to work at the intersections of these, thinking about what it matters and how productivity drivers are changing and how we can rethink what matters in the productivity landscape, and particularly acute in the UK, given the nature of the productivity puzzle that we face. The network's actually co-directed by Philip McCann, who will be speaking later this afternoon and will be familiar to many of you and myself. And we have a range of 10 partners of other universities and also commercial organisations that we're working with who have been contributing to the programme of work since 2018. When we were initially funded by the Economic and Social Research Council in the United Kingdom, the aim was really to try and bring a different tone to the productivity debate, bringing in academics and scholars and practitioners to rethink and provide some additional perspective on the challenge. So not just looking at this from a conceptual lens, but taking it right through to what matters in industry, on shop floors, and how we can understand the challenges as they're being manifest as the nature of work is changing. If we could go forward, please. So one of the areas that you can see what we've been up to, if you want to take the time to have a look at the website, it's productivityinsightsnetwork.co.uk. And you can see what we've achieved over the last 3 years. The nature of the network itself and how we've sought to do this is actually by stimulating innovative and pioneering projects which unpick different aspects of the productivity puzzle, which to date we've seen have perhaps been marginal to the debate, to try and bring them in and provide that interdisciplinary lens. So do take a moment if you can after the event today to have a look. And if you'd like further information, please contact us through the website. You'll see a range of briefings and the project outputs that we've got on the website there as well. Okay, next slide, please. So one of the things that we've been doing with the project team and the projects that we've funded is really to try and develop a series of outputs. And we've tried to bring these together through 2 substantive collections to date. The first one published last year called Productivity Perspectives. First of all, really tried to identify that range of different interdisciplinary lenses on the productivity puzzle, taking a range of issues from those that we might expect around work and organisation, but looking at healthcare, looking at the social and the well-being challenges that we kind of understand, as Nadim laid out, associated with the productivity debate. Over the last 9 months, we've been working to try and produce this latest collection, which was released earlier this month. Focusing on productivity in the pandemic, again, looking at the nature of the challenges of productivity and the opportunity to perhaps rethink, recalibrate, and really understand how we can make a difference in policy and practice in the wake of the pandemic. I think the nature of the book really picks up on the fact that we are not simply going to bounce back. There's going to be this notion of bouncing forward and how we can really pick up on those opportunities which have been born out of the COVID crisis. The next slide, please. So finally, it's worth saying that the Productivity Insights Network, which was funded in 2018, will come to an end. It is a project which was there to try and stimulate that interdisciplinary debate. But we have a new flagship initiative in the UK, which is funded by the Economic and Social Research Council at the Productivity Institute. So I put up the website there and the Twitter feed, which I would encourage you to have a look at. There are a number of the investigators that have been associated with the Productivity Insights Network who are also involved in the Institute, but the work will continue, and particularly for us around that regional and the geographic theme, which is being led by Philip McCann. So I suppose really before handing back to you, Alexandra, I'd just like to say thank you again to you and to colleagues at the OECD in helping us put together today. I hope those in attendance will enjoy the range of speakers that we've got, and I look forward to engaging in the debate as we go through. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Tim. Thank you. We are looking forward to working together with you and Productivity Institute. And hopefully today our meeting will help understand and see how we can bounce forward. So for those of you who joined us before, today we are using slightly different structure. For the first time, we have 3 different sessions with breaks in between. We will be talking about spatial productivity wherever possible, but the main point is to understand how productivity and understanding of productivity growth has been changed by the pandemic and how we can make the most out of it going forward. So we'll start with the basics, labor, skills, and it is what our first session is about: labor markets, labor policies, and skills development. After a break, we'll probably pick up the most glorified driver of productivity growth, which is innovation. But we will also carefully look at the systems approaches, because apparently linear thinking doesn't get us far. And the last session, which will be very dense, I think, we called it paradoxes, but it will talk about all the things that has been changed by the pandemic as it relates to productivity, and it will be heavily focused on resilience, because it looks that in our pursuit of productivity, we might undermine our ability to face certain types of shocks. And probably going forward, we need to understand better how to reconcile our quest for efficiency and resilience at the same time. So without further ado, I would like to move to the first session. We will have different moderators for each session. So I'm welcoming Karen Maguire, who is Head of Local Employment Skills and Social Innovation Division here at the CFE. So Karen, the floor is yours.
Great, thanks, Alexandra, and good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, because I know we have quite an international crowd here joining us today. So for this discussion, we're really pleased to welcome Eckhard Ernst, Chief Macroeconomist at the International Labour Organization, and Anne Green, Professor of Regional Economic Development at the University of Birmingham in the United Kingdom. And we're really excited about this discussion. In particular, at the OECD, we have a program called the Local Employment and Economic Development Program within the center, where one of the really important issues is how to take some of these big picture trends, macro trends, et cetera, and translate that into concrete policies for national and local governments. So we really look forward to the debate today. So we'll have 2 presentations of about 15 minutes each, and then we'll get into more of an open discussion. As Alexandra mentioned, you may start while you're listening to the presentations, you may start typing your questions, liking other people's questions, and then by the time we get to the open debate, hopefully we'll have a series of interesting discussion points to follow up on those presentations. So I'd like to invite first to take the floor, Eckhard Ernst. Thank you. You have 15 minutes. Look forward to the discussion.
Thank you very much, Karen, and thank you very much for the OECD and PIN to invite me here today. It's a great pleasure and honor to be here. Thanks in particular to Tim and Philip, who made actually this collaboration possible between ILO and myself and the PIN network. So it's great to be here. Now, I thought if you want to go to the first slide, I thought because of the nature of the shock, we might want to have a look, first of all, at some kind of global consequences of this for global labor market. And here I'm presenting latest work that is being done by my colleagues from the statistics department. They have done an excellent job by basically putting together real-time estimates about how deep the shock on global labor markets actually was. And you can see here we are thinking more in terms of lost hours lost rather than employment loss, simply because in many countries, in many regions, it's the total effect on working time that is relevant for this crisis. And I think so. I mean, obviously by now everybody is aware of how deep the crisis and how fast it was. But I think what's important to recognize here also in this chart here is that the adjustment of this crisis of global labor markets is very different depending on both the level of development, but also the region you're looking at. You see some countries and some regions rather having a relatively large increase or drop in the number of working hours, the large increase in number of working hours lost. Whereas other countries or other regions actually feeling the impact more in terms of increase in inactivity, which is really surprising, because when you look at lower middle income countries, for instance, there's a massive increase in inactivity simply because people can simply not work. You think about India or so, these are countries where especially in the informal labor market, people were no longer available to or no longer had the possibility to work. Now, you think that's only something this is true for lower middle income countries. I can tell you from Geneva, where I'm based, we had people here in the domestic service economy, where mostly people in the informal service sector here could no longer work. They could no longer exercise their physical presence at the employers, and so had to basically stand in line waiting for handouts. It was something that you wouldn't expect in Geneva, and this is the kind of labor market situation you see in a lot of lower and middle income countries. Whereas in higher income countries, as you can see here, unemployment, and especially in North America, unemployment was the preferred adjustment mechanism in these countries. So the heterogeneity of the impact, obviously it translates also into heterogeneity of the labor productivity impact. But I think before we go into that kind of discussion, I think it might be still useful to have a closer look at the specific dimensions of the shock and how this affects different occupations, different sectors very differently, giving their characteristics of both the shocks and the nature of the work that people are doing in the sector. So if you go to the next slide, we see that obviously most sectors have had negative, I mean almost all sectors have negative employment by summer last year. So these are real-time estimates, as I said, that were published earlier this month, or last month rather. And you see that, but you see that the large variation in terms of sectoral impact that it has. You know, it's like hospitality, so social services, personal services were obviously the ones that are most heavily affected, and they are still affected as we're moving through the second wave of the pandemic. But what's most important is that not only were these sectors particularly affected by the crisis, but these are also sectors that are highly at risk of automation. So we actually can see already that some of these automation effects are already present, and the crisis is likely to accelerate. So even if we expect a recovery to take place this year, we are certainly not expecting to have the recovery very equally spread out across all sectors and occupation. So which is what some people believe to be a K-shaped recovery. So some sectors will actually recover quite quickly and quite strongly, whereas other sectors, especially those who are at high risk of automation, will actually maybe see recovery, but not in employment, potentially in productivity. Now, the dimension obviously doesn't stop at the risk of automation. If we go to the next slide, we see that there's also the international dimension behind it, and here you see that actually, interestingly enough, whereas the risk of automation was mostly in rather low-skilled sectors, here you see the risk of automation, or the risk of disruption is rather happening at sectors of high skills like automotives, electronics, and other transport equipment. But so the question that becomes is to what extent some of these sectors might actually see some kind of different type of adjustment mechanism as we move out of the crisis. Do we see, are these sectors coming back as they were before? Because they are, I mean, especially transportation equipment is obviously extremely important for most OECD economies. Or do we see some kind of spreading of risk that businesses take across the world? Can we really believe that some of the electronics move to different countries, or will they be basically stuck on where they are? And I think these disruptions to supply chains is something that we need to kind of very carefully look at, because it does have such a strong productivity impact going forward. Now, if you go to the next slide, we see that in addition to the automation risk and the globalization risk, you also see specifically with the COVID crisis, obviously the fact that occupations in this time, not so much sectors, are very different in terms of to the extent to which you can work from home. We are obviously all sitting at our home in our home offices and can do more or less the same type of work than before. But many other occupations don't have that luxury, and often enough it means that these occupations are often also the ones that are low skilled, low wage, and at high risk of not being able to function properly as they have seen in the past. And the question is, once the pandemic is over, will this basically just return as before, or will some of the adjustment that we have seen in terms of automation, will that already have affected the extent to which this occupation can bounce back, simply because some of the occupation will, because of their lack of being able to work to occupy from home, will just simply not come back. And so I think that if you look at the adjustment mechanism in the next slide, what is really key to understand is that we see a lot of occupation under heavy risk of automation, and in addition, this particular COVID shock. And these occupation, which you see towards the right side of these two charts, so the left chart is on unemployment, and the right side, the right chart is on long-term unemployment rate. You see on each of these charts at the right side are occupation at a high skilled and at low skilled and high risk of automation. What's more important is this chart actually tells you is that these occupations are often dead ends. So once you lose them, it's extremely difficult to move from this occupation to any occupation further to the right, to the left of the chart. So it is to say that this idea, we just have to activate these people and reskill them, this is probably not going to happen as easily as we thought it would be. Simply not only because they don't have the right skills, but because it's not easy to find a pathway between the current competences and skills and those skills and competence that they would need further to the occupation on the left chart, of the left side of the chart. So let me finish with some broad remarks on this. And if you go to the next slide, please. And I think it's really something that is kind of close to my heart, is that we take this idea of resilience really as a new policy paradigm. I know that a lot of people are talking about this, and it's really something that the word is used abundantly in the discussion right now. But I think most people don't really realize what it really means. The first thing I think which is important to stress is that we are seeing shocks now, and we have been seeing shocks over the last 10 to 20 years, which are very different from this typical business cycle shocks. I mean, you know, the famous black swans already. Now we even have green swans. That's somebody from the BIS, from the Bank of International Settlements, came up with this idea. So these are shocks we might think about, that we know something about them, but we don't properly take them into account. So they have high uncertainty, fat tails, if you want. So basically, if once they happen, they have a large impact. And the typical policy assessment that you would do in the normal circumstances just don't work anymore with this type of shock. So what you need is stress testing, what is being done in the financial sector. We should do that also for labor markets increasingly. That's why I showed you the previous chart. What's the stress first for a labor market when you hit with such a large shock? We need scenario work, etc. So we need to find a way of kind of robust policies, as I call them, which are policies that somehow identify or work on the large range of possible outcomes that we see on the labor market. The second point, I think, is why now it has become rather standard, and I use here a phrase from the IMF. Actually, inclusiveness is macro-critical, which is to say that inclusive labor markets are essential for countries to bounce back properly. The interesting part with the first chart I showed you is those countries who actually have relatively uninclusive labor markets are also the ones who face the largest challenge currently in terms of bouncing back. And I think it's important to keep that in mind, that inequality is not only a social cost, it's an economic cost and an economic efficiency cost for that. That means that we need to kind of reserve some policy space in order, A, to make sure that we have speedy intervention. You see that in those countries who actually managed to rapidly intervene in the labor markets also have seen much less of an impact on their labor market. So speedy intervention is necessary, even at the cost of not targeting. So the idea of targeting and making sure that you really identify the proper person in such a shock is not appropriate. It also means that we need some excess capacity or some proper digital infrastructure in particular to actually address some of these challenges that we're currently seeing. And I think that some of the question that you had, Karen, for me, is addressed by that issue. We need proper public infrastructure that is up to the 21st century standards. We don't need fax machines in health centers anymore. We really need proper digital infrastructure for that. Otherwise, we're not being able to address these shocks and the speed at which these shocks happen. So if you go to my last slide, then two more points that I would like to make. One is obviously that in this type of complex shocks that we're seeing with global implications, with both demand and supply shocks, there are policy complementarities that we need to take into account. And I mean, fortunately enough, central banks at least have kind of taken up that challenge and really understood already, probably with the experience from the global financial crisis, that they needed to intervene. But I think it's also important for policymakers in other areas, including in labor markets and social ministries, to understand that there are complementarities that need to be taken into account, that activation measures need to be identified or need to be complemented with proper skills policies in order to be actually having an effect and being able to prepare our economies for the structural shift that is coming behind on the back of this COVID shock. And then maybe my last point is it's just kind of this entire idea of designing for resilience. I think it's something that needs to be properly taken into account. And it means that we need to leave some spare capacity. Efficiency is good as a goal for good times, for smooth, regular business cycles, etc. If you have these large shocks, and unfortunately we seem to have increasingly more frequently this type of large shocks, we need to have some spare capacity. Over adjustment to an optimal skill mix is not necessarily the best strategy if you want to translate it into issues for the labor market. So we rather want to be able to have people having some kind of general skill sets, allowing them to screen through a range of opportunities on the labor market, rather than trying to identify the 4 digital skills that would give them opportunities to move into other opportunities or other job opportunities. So I think these are kind of my 5 takeaway points that I would like to share with you today, and I'm looking forward for the discussion later on. Thank you very much.
Great, thanks so much, Eckert. And I think it's really interesting, the different diagnoses and ways of analyzing the labor markets. And I think as you mentioned, the crisis has really brought our attention to different measures beyond headlines, a couple of headline indicators, as ways to sort of give a diagnostic of your local labor market. And I know you mentioned regions of the world in the ILO, and it's sometimes when we use the word region, we're talking something a little bit smaller, but it's true that when we look at some of the statistics that you raised, and for colleagues on the call who are interested, we can do a little bit of a zoom in some of OECD countries across regions. So just to give a little context for some of Eckert's data here, we looked at high risk of automation, those ranges between 4% and 40% within OECD regions, or those where the kinds of jobs where this, they just physically can't practice their employment. We see ranges from 15 to over 50% in some of the sort of tourist economy regions. And then also in terms of these, how this plays out, your item on the remote working by occupation. And we see, for example, around 13 percentage point difference between urban and rural places within countries. So that was really great to get that big macro perspective. And then some of the policy implications we'll go to in a minute. Before we turn to Anne, I just wanted to check if you could maybe just clarify real quick for everybody, because your first chart had some really raised some really important points about it's not just unemployment, it's also inactivity and drop in hours worked. Could you just clarify if the data on inactivity, if that includes those who are on the European furlough schemes that we see, or are they not included in those statistics? Just a question that was in the question and answer.
No, I mean, inactivity really is what the standard definition of inactivity is. So if you remember the red bars I showed you, these are short or zero working hours. So these are people on furlough schemes that are still officially attached or officially have a job, but basically don't come to work anymore, or work very few hours only. So you have the 0 hours, they are still employed officially according to official statistics. And then inactivity is basically those who don't have a job and don't look for one.
Great. Okay, so that I think that answers for Peter Austin, who had a question here on that. So we'll just clarify that has been answered. Thank you so much. So I think what we'll do now is we'll go to because there's some other questions here, but we'll get to that in the discussion because they're a bit longer for answers. So now we're going to turn to Anne Green and look forward to hearing your presentation.
Okay, thank you very much, and thanks to the OECD and PIN for inviting me through to this then. So if we can just move forward, please, to my next slide. I'm going to just start off by something about education and training if the foundation of skills for labour markets and going forward. And clearly the literature has outlined the link between skills and their deployment, and obvious that positive link through to innovation, productivity and regional growth. So that kind of goes without saying. And I think a lot of what we've heard about, and is important not just for now, but for the longer term, is the focus of the debate on the disruption to the education and training system and its impact on children and young people. I'm sitting here in England at the moment, we're in our third national lockdown, and schools for most children are shut and will be until March at the earliest. And I think it's interesting to note here, if you look back at the literature about previous natural disasters or wars, that actually keeping schools open was fundamental at those times. And perhaps we haven't done quite as well in this pandemic as perhaps in previous crises of that nature. So I think that's an important thing to say. And clearly we've had a lot of emphasis on children in the crisis, and also about young people, particularly about those about to enter the labour market. We know in previous difficult times, the scarring effects that might cause, the issues of good transitions being very helpful. And also we know about the importance of work-based learning, and that has been disrupted by what we've been through over recent months. And the whole issue about how does work-based learning work when you've got social distancing, etc. So we've had a lot of focus on children and young people. And very recently in the UK, we've had some estimates published about the cost of this learning loss. And over an individual's lifetime, that might be £40,000 lost earnings. A year of schooling increases individuals' earnings by 8% per year. And just think about, in England, a lot of children will have missed 6 months learning. And then as bubbles of school children have gone out and not been at school, that's extra capacity lost. A lot of learning is cumulative. So I think if we're thinking about it, we're hearing a lot about mental health now, but it's also about this learning loss suggests a less productive workforce going forward. And that has both implications for the economy and society going forward. So just put that in, I'll start off with that. And if we go to the next slide, please, I want to say something about the sorts of challenges and opportunities in the skills space and local labour market space that the pandemic has brought to light. We've obviously seen challenges of some things are less easy to do online effectively. I think some of the social and emotional skills, the soft skills that are very important in terms of people's contribution and contribution to collaborative working, some of those are somewhat less easy to develop virtually than actually face-to-face and in-person interactions. We've obviously got, as when we talk about moving online, the digital divide raising its head again, and then the idea of accentuation of inequalities. And that in turn has implications for social mobility going forward. So the whole of this challenge, accentuation of inequalities, how do people who are less advantaged actually move forward to get advantage going forward? And we've also seen, you know, the whole issue in more practical terms about how do we address this learning loss going forward as education reopens in face-to-face forms. We've also, though, seen various opportunities. If you told me a year ago that I could have done as much as what I've done at home, I would have not believed you. We've gone through a forced experiment, and I think it's shown a lot of us what we can do, and it's surprised some of us, I think, what we can do. I think it's also brought to the fore things like online and blended learning that can be very helpful for people who want to upskill, want to learn, and can do it much more flexibly. It's shown that. We've also seen the potential for sharing of learning content and skills development between providers. But as yet, we don't really have strong evaluations of what works and what works for whom and where. And we've also seen that there's a lot been in innovation in the edtech industry. So, you know, possibilities going forward. So I think we've done a lot, but there's also a lot of challenges there. And I think this key theme of the inequalities in all of this. So if we move on to the next theme, please. Clearly, as we've been in this situation, I'd like to just highlight really some of the things that we often think about in a crisis, some of the kind of matching interventions in terms of counselling, vocational training and learning, etc. And in the short term, I think we've seen a lot of emphasis on moving from hard hit sectors, some of those we've heard about in the previous presentation, to ones where there's an increase in demand. So from hospitality to the care sector, from aviation to health. And that might sound a bit stupid, but actually it's worked very well in Birmingham, where you've got people, cabin crew from Birmingham Airport going into hospitals because actually they're quite good at de-stressing people in difficult situations. So some of the things you might not always think about. We've also seen platforms, virtual platforms that have been focused on recruitment, shifting into redeployment. How can we retain high-level skills within the sectors between companies moving about in, say, manufacturing, engineering, and the STEM sector, etc.? So we've had those sorts of things. I think it's also important, though, with an emphasis on the pandemic, not to lose sight of the learning we know from other things. And the importance here of what do we know about helping people who perhaps have had difficult times, the unemployed and the longer term unemployed that actually are getting further back in the queue for jobs? What do we know about helping them to gain employment and meaningful employment, especially with progression? And I think we can take learning from things like the example of Work Advance in the US, where we've been trying to connect people and help people in particular jobs through highlighting the sorts of roles where there are prospects for advancement and really intensively screening them, providing them with pre-employment services, sector-specific job development, and also post-employment and retention and advancement services. And I think all of that's important for thinking about productivity and skills going forward. Now, if we move on to the next slide, please. I want to now go from the sort of the global level to what this might actually really mean down at the front line amongst a particular sort of group of people in a particular place. And I'm going to use the example here of the Bangladeshi catering sector in Birmingham. This is what people might term the sort of Indian curry house sector. And in the UK, Bangladeshi people have been disproportionately concentrated in the restaurant sector as first-generation immigrants. The second generation has been better educated. They've moved into, some of them have moved into professional jobs, etc. So even before we came to this crisis, we had this kind of demographic, competitive and generational change that were threatening their survival. And then you get COVID, and that's a perfect storm. So what we've got is a sector that is really characterized by informal working practices. It's not really linked to business support. It's got a reliance on family labor, often very small businesses. Productivity for them is about volume and efficiency, very much driven by competition and low profit margins. And actually now, as the hospitality sector closes down, you've got the issue where they can't afford to open, really, but they can't afford to close either. They're really on the brink. Now, one of the things that we've been doing in a project here is actually this sector wasn't really socially media savvy at all. There's been some very local grassroots initiative involving students to introduce some of these businesses to social media so they can actually move online and do some of their takeaway stuff that they, never did before in some instances. So also on this, I think it's important to think about, if we're thinking about skills and some of the challenges moving forward and the COVID crisis on top, to think about some of the social impacts of this. And that slide I've got there on that graph shows the share of the working age population in shutdown sectors in England and Wales by ethnic group and age. And if you draw your eyes to the Bangladeshi sector, you'll see they're disproportionately hard hit. But also, very interestingly, if you look at the dark green bars, that's the older age groups. It's the older age groups that have been disproportionately hard hit, whereas for the white British groups, it's been the younger people. So they're quite an interesting thing there to note about how this group has more underlying health conditions, greater risk of infection. Bangladeshi population lives in larger households. They also tend to often live in one-earner households, so they don't have a fallback position. So I think what I wanted to emphasize here is that alongside all of these general trends at the very sort of global level, if we delve down into local areas amongst particular people in particular sectors, in particular groups, in particular communities, that actually what the reality is and some of how things come together to pose a very difficult situation and how some grassroots initiatives might help. And then if we move forward to my final slide, please. Just want to say some general issues about the skills system. And I think we know from international evidence that there's strong underpinning of successful local working in skills system and the sorts of things that are important. So if we look at the right-hand side there, you can see things like having a sufficient funding. That's going to be important in this crisis. Having local capacity and expertise to plan ahead. Resilience we've heard about, adaptability and responsiveness. And I think one thing we have actually learned quite a lot over the last year is about the importance of local collaboration across the piece, not only in the economic and skills arena, but more generally, and strong partnership working, be that locally, nationally or sectorally. And then also I just wanted to highlight just a few things, other things that are on the left-hand side of that slide. Some of the issues that we might want to be thinking about, particularly in the skills system, at various different geographical levels going forward. I think particularly we know about future skills, sort of scales and requirements. I particularly also want to mention, as well as qualifications, some of the skills we're going to really need going forward in the workplace: digital, STEM, social and emotional skills. And also, I think going forward, we're increasingly hearing about well-being, and also thinking about well-being as both an input to productivity, if you like, and an outcome from it. So I think that's kind of rising up the agenda. And that also, I think, highlights the role of managers in all of this scene, line managers in supporting and championing workplace skills development and utilisation, whether that's actually in the physical workplace or working virtually. And then I just finally, as we're all getting older, living longer, etc., and we've heard about automation, etc., we always do hear a lot about new entrants. And I started a lot talking about children and young people at the outset. Often our learning and skill systems have been focused on them. But importantly, going forward, we do have to have much more opportunities for lifelong learning and allowing people to dip in and out in a bespoke way. And perhaps we've learned something that isn't impossible from what we've gone through in the last year. So thanks very much, and I'll stop there.
Great, thanks a lot, Anne. And really, it was a nice compliment to sort of take it down and even zoom in on very specific populations in specific places and see what this sort of constellation of impacts can be. Maybe just a question to both of you, and you've alluded to different elements of the impacts on productivity, whether it's a reduction in productivity of individuals due to lost education or lost work-based learning, less productive use of adults because you have increased levels of inactivity, etc. Just wanted to ask the panelists if they had any other comments they wanted to make specifically on the sort of productivity angle going forward and what that might mean for different places, different people, and if you have any reflections in particular on the role of even a more regional, local factors that could be part of this equation.
Shall I have a first stab at that? I think going forward, if we're thinking about sort of changed ways of working going forward, I wonder if one of the things we're really missing and that we've got to kind of recreate as we go forward, and it would help productivity, it would help innovation, etc., is some of those more serendipitous exchanges that we're missing out on at the moment. And I think we might be able to recreate some of those locally on a smaller scale in shared workplaces, co-working spaces going forward. If we're thinking about automation and how we actually go forward, and if we go to a sort of new normal of new ways of working, I think some of that, how do we rebuild some of that social capital that we get from, that we can't really do so well by just seeing somebody their head and shoulders on a Zoom screen. We don't get that in the same way, in a formalized way as we can do informally. So I'm not sure if that's exactly what you're getting at, but I do think some of that we can do at a local level and try and recreate. And I think it would help people in themselves, and it might help the society and the economy going forward as well.
If I can just compliment to what Anne was just saying before, I very much like your point, Anne, on lifelong learning. I think that this is really a point that we also stress very much at the ILO, and in our centenary declaration 2 years ago, we had a strong focus on this point as well. And I think that what is interesting with lifelong learning is that we have been talking about since the 80s about this, but I don't think that anybody has really found a proper solution to that. And for me, one of the reasons for this, and there are actually two reasons I would say. One is the obvious lack of funding, and you mentioned that as well in your presentation. And I think that this goes both to the education system, but increasingly also for how do we finance the opportunity cost for people in their mid to late stages of their career to actually go and take up such additional training. But I think, and this comes back to the point that I was raising at the end of my presentation, I think one of the aspects we're also missing is this foresight on labor markets. So we have all these employment services, these public employment services, but they don't do any foresight. They kind of adjust to when the shock hits. You know, when you have all these 10,000 and 100,000 people unemployed, then they kind of realize that they need to do something, but they don't kind of do proactively helping people to adjust their competences, to build up their competences gradually. So it takes time, you know, and the more skilled we are, the more time it takes to actually build some of these new competences that we need. And I think it's interesting. I had earlier this week, I had a discussion with a big tech company in France, and they were telling me how difficult it is actually for them to convince the French Pôle emploi, so the French public employment services, to actually get to use some of these technologies to do some of this foresight. And I think that and this is very local. I mean, if you talk about spatial inequalities, the skills that you need in Paris might be very different from the skills that you need in Lyon or in Birmingham or whatever. And I think that this kind of expertise that you actually do have at the local level to leverage that and to help both the educational system, the local employers, and current or prospective job seekers to actually find the right competence. I think there's an obvious need for coordination and for a labor market foresight that could and should be leveraged in order to help prepare local labor markets for those shocks or for future shocks that are coming.
Great, and I think, you know, these points, I mean, we'll try and OECD work also to highlight, but there are some examples where there have been some public employment services that are doing a bit more perspective. I know we just did something in the Basque Country where they've developed a model, for example, in their public employment service to do that. And I know there are some places, for example, in Australia that are trying to anticipate where there would be redundancies and try and act before they occur. So I think we need to learn more about these models and scale them up in response to what both of you just said. I think since we're starting to get more questions here, and you answered a little bit already in your presentations, the other question I was going to ask on what we need to change a bit in our skills policies. Why don't we go to some of the questions from the audience here? And we have one from Pieter Parmentier, and it's really here we have, you know, in the event of large-scale redundancies, what are the tools for the private and public sectors, and how can they collaborate better together to guide people into these other jobs? And in particular, for these workers that are going to be maybe more of a challenge, older workers and low-skilled workers. And, you know, you raised in both of your presentations how some of the low-skilled workers are being doubly hit from a number of different factors from the crisis, whether they can't operate at all or they are in jobs at risk of automation, et cetera. So they get what in the US we call a double whammy in getting hit. But I mean, what would you have any ideas on these other tools that the private and public sector can do to really help with this movement into other kinds of jobs, other sectors?
I think often in the past, when we've had these kind of large-scale redundancies, we have had sort of local responses in specific task forces come together and helping people. I think what's different about doing it now is the actual bandwidth for that sort of thing, alongside dealing with everything else that's going on, and also, I suppose, the issue of what else is there locally that you can feed into. So I think it is a case of learning from what we've done before, but I think often it's a lot of the bandwidth aspect of that you know, is there enough capacity amongst local collaborators to do it? I suppose what is different now is there is more that you can do online. There are more tools to help people you know, probably investigate the sorts of careers and job changes, and you know, there are things that have been developed where people can look to see where their skills might be used. I mean, I think it's the older, lower skilled people who are perhaps less able to do that. They're the ones that are probably be left by the wayside. So I think some people are better equipped to do it yourself approach than others. I think that's what I would say in answer to that.
Yeah, just to echo that, I mean, I perfectly agree. I think we actually got here some requests from the Canton of Geneva because Geneva is one of those areas in Switzerland that's very particularly hard hit in the hospitality sector, and this is the same discussion here. So what do we do with all these people who are in the process of being laid off. The bandwidth is one point, but I would say, I mean, maybe on a more optimistic note, I do think that there's a lot of willingness to collaborate across different sectors, and I'm not talking necessarily sectors in terms of economic sectors, but also sectors in terms of like businesses, social partners. Actually, somebody in the chat mentioned social partners. Where there's a strong willingness across social partners to collaborate and find solutions to that, and trying out new tech solutions, if you want, or new innovative solutions in terms of providing the right competences. It's actually surprising, and you mentioned aviation sector and how people there move to different sectors. In Switzerland, we have a large gap in terms of openings for train conductors, and guess what? The airline pilots are now moving into becoming train conductors. So I think that there is indeed, I mean, people are surprisingly resourceful, I would say, and I think that policymakers in this area really need to kind of leverage all this willingness to collaborate, not trying to reinvent the wheel, but really using whatever tools are available, and really connecting people. I think that because of this lack of bandwidth, which I will perfectly would describe to, and that's something that you can't really solve in the short term, but trying to kind of help and trying to connect different institutions and different players at the local level is really key to address that crisis.
And actually, Eckhart, just so that example you gave of pilots to become train conductors was actually on the French news, so it's well known. And actually, and the aviation, the cabin crew, Sweden has also had that come up of that sort of more grouped training of cabin crew into more healthcare related work. So I think there are some interesting examples we can share and scale up in some of our work to help the different regional and local labor markets here. I'm just looking at some of the other questions because I think we have about 5 more minutes. There's also a question about central business districts. And I think, Anne, you mentioned a bit, how do you recreate the buzz and the potential impacts on productivity and other the fact that we don't have some of those spontaneous interactions that contribute to innovation, that contribute to productivity. And, central business districts were, of course, very well known on that. And I think just if you guys have any specific comments on how these central business districts might bounce forward.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting point. I think we've clearly seen the reduction in footfall in city centres and what have you. But if we cast our minds back, there's always been in the past, we've said that, this is the death of city centres. I think it's just like reimagining what they're going to be like going forward. And I think possibly they're not going to be quite like they were before. But if you think, perhaps 12 months from now or something like that, I think if we move to a situation of more hybrid working, that people work at home some of the time and go into the office some of the time, I think the sorts of people that will be going into city centres, they'll be going there to be doing networking. They'll be going there for the experience economy. That will help the leisure kind of aspect of the city centres. It'll help the hospitality parts of it. We might get more sort of mixed use in city centres. I think people will go to city centres for those bits of work where actually, collaborating with others is important, and then they can be productive at home doing their own thing. So even if they don't bounce back to what they were, I think they've probably still got a future, but it's also thinking about the whole urban realm, and it's thinking about that local ecosystem and the urban form and all of that, as well as everything else. But I think it's probably a bit, it'd be a bit previous to sort of say they're dead. I think they'll come back, but perhaps not to exactly what they were before.
I mean, maybe just to add to that, I mean, one of the aspects that we also see in our discussion with our partners across the world is obviously that the changes to housing markets more broadly. I mean, not necessarily to central business districts, but where do people live and work from? And I think here it's really key as well that some of the policies are oriented towards helping people actually find the right space where they can work from home. I think that this is really an underappreciated point in some of this work from home discussion to actually have the possibility to have the right space and the same kind of work environment at home that you have in your office. I mean, often people work from their kitchen tables or even in worse conditions than that, and don't obviously have the same kind of ergonomic seats, etc. And I think that kind of helping people maybe to either move into places that are more appropriate for to help them work from home I think it's an important aspect to that transition that will come. And I mean, I think that for those who believe that we just move back to the old normal, I don't think that's going to happen. I think that we certainly will not move all the way to a full working from home type of situation, but some of it will stay and will stick simply because the infrastructure has now improved, has invested, etc. I think maybe one aspect that I would like to stress also in relation to my previous presentation is that I think it's important that we keep the information channels open across different jurisdictions, and I mean, Anne mentioned that as well, this serendipity. I see that in our work as well on high tech, on collaboration around high tech, and how this helps to kind of create new innovations. If you shut down these channels, if you shut down any travel and any interaction between people, I think that's really a recipe for disaster for productivity. So that's really something we need to kind of help restore as much as possible. Maybe finding new ways of collaboration, like these online platforms that we're working on now, but also finding maybe alternative ways where we switch between travel and online exchange, which is really essential for this type of serendipity and information exchange. So.
Great, thanks. And I know that, you know, here at the OECD, we'll be looking a bit more on these questions of urban form as well, and different implications post-COVID. Maybe just we have a couple more minutes, maybe just to end on a sort of a very fundamental point that has come up, I think, in your presentations, and Eckert, you raised this issue of you know, social policy, and also the fact that inequality is bad for productivity, or lack of inclusive labor markets is bad for productivity. And so there's this need to convince perhaps other policymakers about how they are complementary, and that they maybe need to be integrated together a bit more. So I'm wondering, and this is a question coming from the founder, founding this Spatial Productivity Lab here, so Joachim Oliveira Martins, but wondering if you could respond to these questions, which are really at the core of some of these mottos about building back better and being more inclusive and thinking about resilience. So Eckert and Anne, if you wanted to touch on that.
Yeah, thank you for this great question, and thanks to Joachim. I mean, this is something I feel very strongly about myself, and I have been trying to promote this idea for a long time. I mean, unfortunately, it needed this type of crisis to get us to this discussion. I would say that, you know, first of all, I think that the best example for this is really to look at those countries who have fared relatively badly in the crisis. And I mean, here I'm talking beyond OECD countries, who also were those countries who had extremely uninclusive labor markets. I mentioned before the large informal labor markets that you see in Latin America, for instance, where people are really struggling to move back up. I mean, some of the statistics I showed were kind of really striking in this respect. So I think that, the awareness is there by policymakers that we need to have better policies to actually promote skills, promote less inequality, and obviously address some of these. Some of these large inequalities don't necessarily only relate to lack of skills. They also relate to large any market imbalances on labor markets. I mean, I think the discussion on monopsony that has been kind of taking hold now, we have some estimates on that, where we can actually show how big this problem is that workers face increasing the market power, not only from tech companies. It's really an issue across the board in different sectors. And I think that's really an issue where we can't really use labor policies properly speaking. I mean, minimum wages is one of the examples that's always being used, but these are often policies, and I know that Diane Coyle is also part of the productivity network. She is very much a fervent defender of stronger competition policies to address some of these imbalances that come from data inequality, etc. So I think that, you know, the idea of having inequalities as being bad, I think has been accepted now. The question is, how do you find the right mix of social policies that you actually help people to find back back into employment without kind of depriving them from the necessary protection. And I think that, you know, we do have some experience now in terms of combining activation policies with proper protection. We probably will need to expand that a bit longer, you know, so kind of providing more support for longer, given the depth of the crisis that we currently see, and helping job seekers and potential kind of those who are affected by this crisis to get the right protection, while still kind of promoting their transition to better and high skilled jobs. So I think that there's a mix that we need to find, and I think we have the right tools for that. It's just we need to implement them, and we kind of, that might require somehow maybe be a bit more relaxed on some of our macro fiscal policies. I think that's the key aspect here. That if we stick to very overly austere and strict fiscal targets, I think that will not help for getting out of this crisis.
Thanks, Eckert. Anne, did you want to join in on that one before we close?
Just to say very briefly that, I mean, I do think that what we've learned from this, I do think there is an awareness about the issue of inequalities, about the need for inclusive growth. I think there is that awareness of it. And I think also, we've seen a stronger link as well through the issue of linking across what might have been different policy domains, like linking about how economic development can lead to better health and all of those sorts of things as well. So I think there is that recognition of it that has risen up the agenda. I think that's important, because I think in some places it wasn't probably recognised enough before. But then you've got the challenge of how to do it, and I think there is various experimentation going forward, and the importance of learning from each other is going to be crucial, I think, as the years ahead.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much, Eckert and Anne. This was really a great discussion, and I know we're going over a couple minutes here, but we'll really just thank you again, because I think you've raised some really critical issues that are going to be important for the Spatial Productivity Lab's thinking going forward in terms of these complementarities between sort of social policies and their implications for productivity. So really, again, thanks for being here with us today. And I guess, Alexandra, will now have a break until 4:15. Is that correct?
Yes. Okay. So we are ready to take 7-minute break, and we will be back in 7 minutes for the second session. That's right. We'll be talking about innovation and systems approaches to recovery. I would like to invite and pass the floor to Mark Ventresca. Hello. He is Associate Professor of Strategy and Innovation at the University of Oxford. Mark joins us all the way from Los Angeles, where it's quite early right now.
It's early in the morning.
Exactly. Thank you so much for your commitment. The floor is yours. We have quite a bit of speakers here, 2 presenters, and everybody else will be joining the discussion.
Yes, that's great. Thank you so much, Alexandra, and welcome everyone. It's really a gift to be here with you. I came in through Tim Vorley's link, so clearly my name isn't Tim Vorley. There aren't 2 of us. He is irreplaceable and remarkable. I am Mark Ventresca, and thank you, Alexandra, for the chance. We have two great papers today, both really approaching this question of renewal through systems thinking, system practices. I'm going to invite both the presenters to share their work with us. I know it's a limited amount of time, but ask them to stay with those limits so we have a chance for some discussion. I also want to suggest a provocation, I think, consistent really with the whole day. Ideas about systems are powerful, compelling. I do a lot of work at Oxford with systems approaches in a number of settings. What often happens, though, is people say it's about systems and then the conversation ends. And I think that both papers and both presenters really want to push us to say, okay, this is interesting and helpful and useful. Now what? What do we do? What are the implications in policy and practice of thinking in this richer, more integrative way? So I know both speakers will point us in that direction, but when we have time for questions and discussion, I want to really encourage people to grapple not with the beauty of the systems concepts, as beautiful as they are, but really, pardon me? And I'm sorry, I don't understand what someone's saying. I don't know. Anyways, I just want to encourage us to really jump in with questions around really specifics of policy and practice when we use these more rich terms. So Jen, over to you. I think you're going to go first. Jen, if you want to briefly introduce yourself and push right into the work you've done.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I should say us today because I'm presenting this on behalf of myself and two collaborators that are also on this presentation. Adam Brown from Cambridge Econometrics and Tim Vorley, whom you all met from Oxford Brookes. And they're going to be on the Q&A later to help me out. But just wanted to make sure that they get a share of the credit and / or blame for what I'm going to say. And I'm going to try and do what Mark challenged us to do there. This has been a really interesting event so far, and I'm really hoping that we can keep the ball rolling with some thought-provoking stuff. But this paper is slightly more conceptual. It's based on a chapter that we wrote for the forthcoming, or I think maybe just published volume by the Productivity Insights Network that Tim introed, if you guys missed it, called Productivity in the Pandemic. So if you can check that out for a bit more detail. I'm not going to do an exact version of that chapter, but we're going to kind of summarize it here, summarize bits of it. So while I think as speakers, we were asked to talk a little bit about how productivity discourse is likely to change in the post-COVID world. We're, like as some of you in this room might know, terrible rule breakers. And so we've opted to interpret that a little bit differently with our own lens. Instead, we're going to focus on, again, as Mark said, thinking about systems thinking as a different lens and how it could change our perspective on productivity as we look towards recovery, and what policy responses should look like when you adopt that point of view. So I hope that we can go, sorry, thanks for switching that. In the short time that I have, I'm gonna try and do my best to introduce systems thinking and highlight how we might use it to tackle recovery and build resilience post-COVID. And I think the really important point here is that this advice and like what we're gonna present here is useful anytime, but we argue that it's particularly relevant in times of crisis, such as we are now, where analysis based on how things have worked in the past might no longer hold, and where learning-led approaches might be a little bit more appropriate. So next slide. I just want to do a quick intro here about what systems thinking is and why it matters. It's a set of tools and a framework for exploring problem spaces as parts of complex adaptive systems. This point of view appreciates that much of the social world in which we operate consists of systems, lots of different ways to think about that, but I think of it as terms of structures, of actors, relationships, and rules, characterized by complexity. And that word is selected quite deliberately. Systems are more than just complicated. Rather, that term is complexity is used to describe systemic attributes that I'm going to go through a little bit more in a bit, but such as interdependence between elements, nonlinear dynamics, emergent behavior, path dependence, and there are a couple of other ones that we're going to highlight as well. In short, this approach views problem spaces as embedded in broader contexts, which of course, but specifically seeks to explain observed outcomes by searching out interdependencies, interactions, feedback loops, sources of interference, and other things in order to better design and experiment with policy. And as I mentioned before, we think that this approach is particularly advantageous now, where we think relationships or trend-based analysis that works really well in times of stability isn't working as well now, or doesn't work as well in times of shock or crisis. And that a systems approach is better able to help us predict, to really understand what's changed, what change we're observing, how relationships will change kind of from here on out, and where trends will go next. Next slide. So a little bit more about what complex systems are. This is a diagram on the right of a very, 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 very simple complex system that illustrates some of the principles that I want to highlight. For me, it's useful to contrast what this diagram here with what we're kind of used to seeing in policy spaces, which are more linear models, characterized by one central goal, for instance, productivity kind of in the middle, and then a bunch of things feeding into that, and where these things are sometimes called pillars or drivers or factors or elements. But the relationship between those things is sort of inwards towards the center, this broader goal of productivity. A systems approach, as you can kind of get from this diagram here, is kind of opposite of that. It's about relationships. And so complex systems are essentially chains of what are actually quite simple relationships. You can look at each of the relationships in isolation, of course, but any given element usually has multiple effects or connections. And more significantly, looking at chains of these relationships reveals important effects, such as feedback loops that can reinforce or amplify effects, or that can be balancing and kind of keep things in check. And it's when those loops kind of get out of whack that things start to change dramatically. It's not necessarily the elements within that system that are the most important thing. It's the relationship between them. Combinations of these things form subsystems that you can, to a certain degree, think of as their own thing. But obviously you have to keep in mind that they don't stand alone, and you have to understand where they fit in the broader system. And that these multiple interacting subsystems form complex systems. So hopefully that was a bit of an intro. I'll dive into some other system characteristics on the next slide. Okay, so as a result of those structures that you saw there, systems have some interesting and sometimes surprising and really important characteristics that are important for theory and practice. Emergence, for instance, which is where unanticipated results can happen further down the chain as a result of feedback loops or the behavior of subsystems. Again, this can amplify small effects, dampen large interventions, or cause all sorts of unexpected outcomes if you're not looking out for them. Punctuated equilibria, it's sort of a myth that systems are typically or usually in equilibrium. They aren't necessarily, and they can exhibit a lot of dynamism, including sudden changes related to shocks. Those changes don't always mean a system is failing or broken. It's just systems, they're characterized by different periods of stability, oscillation, drift, etc. Path dependence is a term that most of you will be familiar with. Simply means that systems have memory. That's useful to know, but might not hold in conditions of systemic crisis. As in now, you can't really rely on how things have gone before. So we might see some interruptions in that. And all of these nonlinear dynamics mean that systems don't behave the way policymakers think they should sometimes, and they get confused about why what they're trying to do doesn't come out. And that's obviously true in normal conditions. As well, like every day, but it's even more so when we try to apply old logics to change systems. And I think today we kind of want to think a little critically about what kinds of changes we're seeing in the systems that we're observing today as a result of COVID. So on the next slide, we and system scholars more generally present systems thinking not as a set of solutions necessarily, but a set of tools and ways of perceiving the world that's a little bit more sensitive to this complexity and kind of like appreciates the broader and more complex systems in which we're based. We also think there's some real risks inherent in not adopting systems approaches. And you could probably get a sense of that just from the description that I gave of systems, like what the pitfalls and traps are. Some of these are obvious, but others aren't. So first, you can fail to see a problem as embedded in broader systems means that we might be making decisions on flawed assumptions. We're only looking at a little piece of it. We miss fundamental connections, not just in terms of these primary relationships, but across the chains of relationships and subsystems. So you're really just, if you make an assumption based on one little relationship, then you might not quite understand what's going to happen later on. More linear ways of thinking in policy tend to favor and encourage siloed thinking, which I think is something we've talked about lots in policy circles, and it makes it more difficult to work across boundaries because you think that you can just take your little piece of the puzzle and like go off with it and do your own thing, and as long as you're good at that, the other people are good at that it's all going to add up to positive results, but that's not necessarily true. It also tends to encourage people to focus on short-term solutions without thinking through longer-term implications. An important element of system structure is that impacts of actions and interventions are not always immediate. There are lags built into things. And so something that looks like it's working initially can create benefits that can be totally wiped out further down the chain and later in time. So really understanding the temporal dimension of those systems is important as well. A good example of that is how you can't build your way out of traffic congestion. Adding more lanes alleviates the problem in the short term, but then shifts incentives and behaviors and congestion returns. And so you see that, what looked like it was a great idea at first wasn't kind of in the longer run. That same example illustrates how we can tend to focus on symptoms and not really think about causes. In this case, congestion is a symptom. The cause is not enough lanes for cars. And so focusing on the symptom is less effective than thinking a little bit about broader causes. Last on this list, and like obviously there are tons more, is that we can assume that what works on one scale might work at another. So skills policy that work to increase talent at the national scale don't have the same effects in regional settings because people tend to be more mobile between places within a nation than internationally. And so all sorts of leakage can happen if you just assume that your region is a closed system. It's not. So there are all sorts of things that happen there. And that was, obviously we can develop the spatial dimensions of this as well. Perfect. Okay, next slide. I'm going to nail this. Right, systems in practice. Anyway, so what? Mark just put up a 3-minute sign, so I'm going to do it. So what? So, well, there are a couple of lessons that we can take away about how we can think about and adopt this in practice. And this is because we don't have a ton of time, like going to be frustratingly shallow, and maybe we can dig into this a bit in the Q&A. But there are some lessons that you can draw from this sort of applying this approach. First, I think really important, we want to acknowledge that we're not visionaries or anything that like just came up with this. Systems thinking and system dynamics modeling have been around for a really long time. People are using this in government. And they're building amazing models and doing all sorts of cool thinking with it. But I think our point here is that we would all benefit if everybody was applying these tools and like thinking in this way, rather than just a handful of people sort of scattered around making policy. So again, we kind of want to avoid tempting simplistic interpretations and analysis. We want to recognize the uses and limitation of trend-based evidence, again, like especially in periods like now where trends are not going to tell you much about what's going to happen in the future when everything's different. I think that also speaks to the idea that you want to dig into causes, just like try and seek out causes instead of like just looking at the immediate thing that's in front of you. I think acknowledge scalar, spatial, and organizational and timescale variations is another one. Again, trying to understand the piece of the system that you're looking at and understand that the various interventions might vary depending on what your objectives are and what scale you're operating at. You want to look out for feedback effects, positive and negative. These can be your friends. So the feedback effects can help you, again, amplify things if you understand them, but they can also totally mess up what you're trying to accomplish if you don't know that they're there. And that, again, it can be reinforcing or it can be balancing. Like something that you're trying to do might actually be, being counterbalanced by something else in the system. If you don't understand that and compensate, then you're not going to achieve the change that you want. And I think the last thing is learn to dance with problems. You got to be agile. It's often, I love that saying, learn to dance. I can't remember who said it. It's pretty famous within the literature, but this idea that you manage complex problems. You don't solve complex problems. They're not things that you can solve. They're things that you manage over time. And so you kind of have to learn how to adapt, understand feedbacks, adapt to those, intervene as appropriate, and like understand that that's a process that happens over time and not like, we solved it, move along.
Right, good.
Yeah, one last thing is that we have all sorts of other recommendations that might be relevant related to experimental governance. Just want to shout out some work for the OECD by David Wolf and Kevin Morgan that like specifically plugs into that. But the main point is that we think that this is a really important moment, and that systems approaches might be able to help us think through what to expect and where to go next with productivity policy post-COVID.
And that's great. Thank you for being so concise. I want to we'll take questions in the group activity after Rudiger's presentation. I want to make one very quick comment. Jen's given us an incredibly concise, rich view, non-jargon filled of systems thinking and complexity and emergent properties. I think the links to productivity, I'll say really quickly, makes me think about what are the conceptions of productivity we have in mind. Are we thinking about both variation and micro experiments within any one system? And then importantly, I think the implications of what you said are, we want to begin to think in comparative terms across policy systems. I think that's the implication of your insights, and we'll have time to develop those more in the question period. Over now to Rudiger Arend, who's going to share with us his work also on innovation approaches, systems thinking and innovation approaches, richly detailed, empirically looking at comparative innovation diffusion processes across Europe and OECD countries. So Rudiger, over to you, please.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Mark. It's a pleasure to be here. Can we have the first slide, please? The idea is basically to looking at innovation in a broader sense and how innovation can help the recovery. And in the first slide, I just wanted to show that the world before COVID was already kind of like challenging. So you already had, for example, automation risk that was coming along for many regions. And in this map, we're kind of like basically crossing it with the risk from COVID and the policy responses, the impact on the economy from COVID. And you see, the red ones are basically the regions which are where the highest impact is expected basically from COVID and also from automation. And the yellow ones are the ones which are having the lowest risk basically from these two threats basically. And you see, there's a wide variation both across and within countries. Can we have the next slide, please? But even like before COVID, we had massive differences between regions. So this is nothing new. That's only came with COVID. On this chart, you basically can see, productivity for the different countries, the country average, and then the regions with the highest and the lowest level of productivity. And what's pretty striking is that in 2/3 of the OECD countries, the region with the highest productivity has a productivity that's twice as high than the region with the lowest productivity. Okay, there's some special cases, but generally speaking, the differences in productivity across space within the single country is just stunningly high. Can we have the next slide, please? And now the question obviously is, what can we do to help regions, and all regions, and in particular the regions where we have low productivity? And how can, in this context of today's meeting, how can a system approach help? So we recently came out with a publication on broad-based innovation policies. And this is basically highlighting 3 lessons. And the first one is that just pushing for R&D is just not enough, because that's leaving many regions behind. Innovation policy needs to take a much broader view, focusing not only on creating frontier innovation, but also on diffusing all kinds of good practices that improve on how firms are organized and produce, and thereby improve their productivity. And this broad view on innovation is particularly relevant in the context of the new decades, or the next 2 decades, where we'll have basically almost all regions that will have undergo a massive industrial transition, not least in the context of the transition to a net zero carbon economy. And learning, I mean, the 3rd pillar we're having here is really the key factor in innovations to firms in different places. So that really is what kind of like makes sure that knowledge, I mean, goes also to the places where you have, I mean, lower productivity. Can I have the next slide, please? But let's first take a step back and look at how frontier innovation happens, and especially where it happens. And what you can see from the slide, I mean, we're using patents as a proxy. I mean, it's not the perfect proxy, but you know, for the purpose of this presentation, I think it's fine. So what we're seeing is there's both a lot of variety, I mean, between countries. I mean, obviously there's countries where a lot more frontier innovation takes place than in others, but also within countries, there are some regions where a lot more innovation takes place than others. And if you're looking at the chart, I mean, you're really seeing that, I mean, frontier innovation, I mean, the innovation ones are the dark blue ones. It's really concentrated. There's really a relatively small amount of regions where really frontier innovation is taking place. And can we have next slide, please? And that basically also holds when you're looking at research and development. So that's basically not very surprising, but I mean, here we're showing R&D expenditure as a share of regional GDP. And what we see is that research and development activities, I mean, they are concentrated in the more productive regions. For example, nearly all OECD countries, the capital regions, that's the ones in yellow dots, have above average R&D. And so the regions which already not have very high productivity, they usually also don't have very high levels of R&D. And in a way, that means that they can benefit a lot from innovation diffusion, but it also means in a way that's the only game in town they have, because I mean, if they want to rely on their own R&D, they're not going to get very far. So I think I've made quite abundantly the point that innovation diffusion is really crucial, and especially so for less productive regions. But then that brings the question of what drives innovation diffusion. So can we have the next slide, please? So the first is obviously framework conditions, as always. They give the incentives for firms to grow and also to be absorptive, to be interested in absorbing innovation. And they include, for example, regulatory environment, existing innovation infrastructure, and private or regional innovation assets. Then the channels for innovation diffusion are the ways that firms learn about relevant innovations. And that's, for example, when they interact with academics or other businesses, when they hire new workers that bring in new knowledge, or when they hire external consultants or get professional business services. And finally, the innovation system, and that's where we're getting to the system part, basically, is that the system that's formed by all the actors. I mean, for example, regional national agencies for innovation, the universities, and so on. I'll have a chart on that with more detail later. And that help firms learn about and to adopt innovation. But the innovation system is not just these actors, but it's also obviously and very importantly the links between all these actors. And we call these actors innovation diffusion actors. So you're going to hear that term a lot going forward. And there is, as we've already seen, or in our research, substantial regional variation in the framework conditions, channels, and actors for innovation diffusion. And we'll come to this shortly. Can we have the next slide, please? But there are also bottlenecks in innovation diffusion. And so that's basically when firms want to learn about and adopt innovations, I mean, then there are these barriers come into place. And they also vary a lot by region, unsurprisingly. And they can arise either from suboptimal framework conditions, that's the green ball we're seeing here. They can arise from insufficient diffusion channels, that's the blue ball, or they can arise from a lack of support from the innovation system, and that's the purple ball. So I'll give you an example of a channel and a bottleneck. Can I have the next slide, please? And that's basically professional business services. I mean, professional business services are quite concentrated in the productive capital regions of countries, as you can see from the chart. But they're also more generally in regions with large urban agglomerations. So that basically means if you're a company who is kind of like either located in those regions where you have all these, I mean, help support, I mean, that's great for you. But if you're a firm who's located, you know, far away from those centers of business services or badly linked to them, then I mean, you are in a much less positive situation, and because basically your diffusion channel, your innovation diffusion channel, is much weaker than otherwise. So I mean, you have a really bad advantage, I mean, in this sense, basically. So can I have the next slide, please? I mean, that slide I told you about the innovation diffusion actors, and that's just going to give you, you know, an intuition of what we mean when we're talking about innovation diffusion actors. I'm not going to read them all for you, but you can have a look and you can see for yourself and discover what we basically mean by that. And that's, you know, that's the part together with the links that's forming the innovation system. So can I have next slide, please? So kind of like, I mean, I'm getting to the end of my presentation, but I wanted to give you a foretaste of the research we are currently undertaking. And what you're seeing here is a map of the innovation system in a fictive region that we have called Growland. And that's the kind of map that we want to do for all the OECD regions, obviously with real data. So we're constructing a toolkit with which we are going to interview stakeholders. And then we're going to use this information to kind of like, I mean, create this maps basically. And what you see here is kind of like the circles. I mean, they correspond to certain functions of certain actors in the you know, in the innovation system. So for example, I mean, if you have a red ball, then that's Economic Development Agency. Orange is a peer learning network, and so on. And then the circle sizes, I mean, basically tell you how important the different innovation actors are in the regional diffusion system. And then the links kind of like, I mean, tell you to whom they are connected and how strong these connections are. And when you have that for a region, and then you can compare to other regions, then you can really get a good understanding of really what the system and region looks like. And then from that, that will really help you in developing policy advice for individual regions. So can I have the next slide, please? So based on our toolkit on this stakeholder questionnaire that I already mentioned, we can then do interesting analysis. Here the slide is again for the imaginary region of Groenland. So it's just giving you an idea of kind of like what we'll be able to do. And so what we can do is we can look separately at each innovation diffusion actor, for example, a local chamber of commerce or a national innovation agency here. And we can then analyze how and how much each innovation diffusion actor helps firms with innovation diffusion. For example, how much the actor helps with learning about innovations, how much they help with capacity building, how much with funding, and so on. And when we do that, we also look at possibly different impact for SMEs and large companies. And then finally, we examine the bottlenecks that each innovation diffusion actor is facing in its mission. For example, how difficult it is for firms to get access to the actor, whether they had adequate funding, whether firms participate sufficiently in their programs, and so on and so forth. So that's basically the idea of a research project we're currently undertaking, and I'll be very pleased to tell you about more in like maybe a year from now, if you're interested. And thank you very much for your attention. Looking forward to the discussion.
That's great, Rüdiger. Thank you very much. Again, a great paper, really drilling into this question of social structure and the kind of architecture of innovation policy diffusion. Again, motivated by this core question, as I understood it, enormous variation across regions and within countries. One task for thinking about productivity in a post-COVID world is reconciling that variation and improving across the board so that we're beginning to bring everyone up to some core standards. I think Rudiger also gave us a very detailed view of the intermediaries involved in innovation policy diffusion, you know, the core system view, then intermediaries involved, and some critical blocks. I think, you know, both papers have given us a lot to think about. They share that interest in systems as complexity with emergent properties, not reducible to linear processes. They share the concern with really recognizing the heterogeneity of nodes within the system and turning that heterogeneity to advantage analytically by doing comparative work at various levels of scale and at various levels of granularity. So we have a number of questions and comments in the chat. I'm happy to read them out and have people raise them. Alexander, maybe you can tell me, I'm not sure, can the audience speak also, or is this a webinar format?
It is a webinar.
Okay, so let me cluster here. I think our speakers can all see these. We have excellent questions. Some are very concrete. Peter Austin says CBDs are core places for innovation work for huge numbers of our societies. What kind of bouncing forward of CBDs? So I'm going to hold that for a kind of a core question. Joaquim Oliveira Martin says Eckhard raised a very important point, the importance of social policies to enhance efficiency. How can we demonstrate this complementary and convince governments of the need for stronger integration of social and economic policies? So I think that question is one of a number that are saying, let's look macro, let's understand these efforts to improve productivity, not only in economic terms, but also across a wider range. And again, I think this is the claim, post-COVID, building back better, that we need to move out of silos. Another question, Stefan Weitzen says, our focus on resilience and learn to dance is probably appropriate in terms of understanding the world and prioritizing survivalism and adaptation. The big problem is how to translate these into valid functional capacities into the language of political programs, future visions, and mobilizing actors. So again, the tension here of using systems thinking in practice, both overcoming political obstacles and the inertia of systems. He goes on to say to build narratives that hold populations together and mitigate further shift toward political mythology of escapism and enemy building. Allison Hunter says, for Rudiger specifically, if innovation diffusion effect is happening, why don't we see this impacting GDP in non-innovative regions? So building on your questions around the asymmetry among current regions and within countries. Finally, Stuart Thompson says, how significant are flagship universities on the local level? Often research is at least nationally based, if not internationally. And so impact of universities is not concentrated where it's based. How do we account for this? So I think there are three kinds of questions. One are some really specific questions, CBDs and how to kind of translate their success, and the role of institutional nodes like a university, which have impact beyond that. Another kind of question, which is, this is all well and good. How do we engage this with the political reality, current political economy, current policy architectures and inertia? And a third question, how do we begin to imagine a language that mobilizes and catalyzes all the actors toward new possible futures? And don't those new futures need to be integrated across both social and economic policies? So let me invite the panelists and others to join in on those issues, to approach them wherever they'd like. Jen or Rudiger, and then we can open up to Tim and others on the call.
Yeah, I'll jump in on who's that question from Stefan, which is one that actually comes up pretty much every single time, and I have really unsatisfying answers for this. The issue with systems approaches like Yes and Learning to Dance is that they're very context specific. And so there are general things that we can say that you want to adopt, and sort of mindsets to adopt. And then there are specific types of obstacles and specific types of networks that you might be dealing with, that are sort of hard for me to answer in the specifics. So like, you have something in mind, I don't necessarily know. But I think that the point about this idea of like, how do you build narratives that, how do you harness this in order to bring people together? And I actually think that systems thinking is actually, and methodologies, and we can get into that in a minute, is actually a really useful tool for that, because it sort of starts with this position of discovery. It's not like you go, like, it's really important for you to not, as an expert necessarily, to sit there and as a policymaker to sit there and be like, I know what this is. It's you know, I know what this looks like. It's more of a process where you kind of go out and look and try and understand what's going on. Not based on prior experience, but based on like what is right now. And so it's in fact a very collaborative, it can be a very collaborative process, and something that is useful for inviting lots of different groups into, and different people that you might not necessarily interact with across silos or across scales or across different policy communities, to the table. And because it sort of starts, I mean, I think ideally from this, like, we are all here to learn, rather than we're here to tell each other what's what, then you can engage in collectively building some sort of narrative that brings you together around this, like, let's buckle down and try and solve something. So that, I mean, that is a very idealistic kind of read of how this is, but I think that there's opportunities to kind of use this as a mechanism to bring people to a table around issues across, you know, policy silos to try and move things forward. And it's a sort of open, benign thing.
Okay, I'll follow up. I mean, I'll start with Alison's question, which is a very good one. Basically, why we're not seeing more innovation diffusion, or I mean, or whether innovation diffusion is happening. And I think it is happening. I mean, you are seeing also regions with low productivity, they're having growth rates. I mean, they're not growing, or the productivity is not growing as fast as we would like it and as we would need to be for have convergence. But I mean, many of them are growing. Then obviously there's also the problem that, I mean, especially in low capacity regions, which typically also, I mean, tend to have low productivity. I mean, often, I mean, the innovation system is just not very well developed. I mean, you know, all these actors that I was talking to you about. I mean, if you go to certain countries, even in the European Union, I mean, you'll find very, very little of them. Or I mean, you find them maybe on paper, but not in reality. And so, I mean, in a way, it's also not so surprising that in these circumstances, I mean, innovation diffusion isn't taking place as much as you would like to have it. So, I mean, innovation diffusion is not the only game in town. I mean, when the institutions aren't there and when there's no institutional capacity, a lot of corruption or things like that, I mean, then obviously, I mean, things are a lot more difficult. So, I mean, that I guess explains, but I mean, what we're trying to understand is really kind of like, which are the critical institutions, which are the critical links, and to be able to kind of like, I mean, advise better on innovation policies, or kind of like, I mean, what should you be doing, I mean, basically in your region to make sure that this innovation diffusion takes place more, happens more than it has been before. And that's in a way where we're doing this project, other than, I mean, also stressing just the pure importance of innovation diffusion compared to R&D, because a lot of politicians, when they think innovation, they're still mainly talking R&D, and we really want to stress also this very important second channel. I'm not saying that R&D isn't important, don't misunderstand me, it's very important, but it's not helping those regions where you have low productivity today, basically. The second point, the second question from Stuart was on the importance of local universities. They're kind of like saying that research was kind of like, you know, national or even international. So kind of like, what do your local universities do, which may not be like, you know, among the top universities in the world. They may not be, but they're incredibly important for the local systems, basically, because I mean, they kind of like make sure there's a certain amount of human capital in the region. They are closer to, you know, what's happening in the region, so they kind of like try to adapt to the needs of the region. So they often are the ones who are really kind of like dealing with the local enterprises. So they're incredibly important. And I mean, there's also kind of like research work on that, which is really showing, I mean, that having a local university in a region is really making a huge difference for the regional development path in the medium long term. Obviously, it's not you put it up overnight and next year things are gone, are much better. I mean, that's not the way it works. And also kind of like, I mean, you also need to make sure that these links between the university and the ecosystem in the region are there. I mean, if you're putting in a university which is on a topic which is, you know, totally apart from anything happening in the region, and people are just flying in and out, and then obviously there's no spillover, so it doesn't make much sense for regional development. So really, but if you have a university which is well anchored, it's an incredibly important institution. And the last point on Peter's question on the central business districts, I may have a slightly more optimistic or slightly diverging opinion at that point, because if you're looking at places like Paris, I mean, there's just incredibly high demand of people to live in the center of Paris. So a lot of people are priced out of the market So basically, if, as is to be expected in kind of circumstances, there'll be less offices in the future, that'll just mean there'll be more people to afford to move into Paris. And if the situation goes back to a kind of non-COVID situation, I mean, if for the next 2 decades we're having kind of like, you know, plagues and, you know, I mean, COVID type diseases all the time, obviously, I mean, that would totally change the game. But making the assumption that everybody's making at the moment that after COVID we go back to kind of like a normal situation, then what will happen is maybe some enterprises may be moving out, we have a bit more of teleworking, but other people will be moving in. I mean, kind of like prices may changing a bit in the inner cities, but they'll still be very vibrant, still be very attractive. Maybe you have a bit less shops, but you know, I mean, do you really need all the shops in a city center to make it vibrant? You know, I mean, you can, I mean, if you have more people moving in, you may also be ending up having up more social spaces, more green spaces. So I mean, I don't think that that this really has any long-term major negative impact on the central business districts, on the centers of the cities, in those countries and in those cities where those places are attractive. I mean, in those places where they're not attractive, obviously, I mean, that may be a different story. But where it may make a difference, and that's something I haven't really heard very much, is basically it's not really the outskirts which are far out where you have a house with a garden, but in cities you typically have an area which is not the city center, but a little bit further out, where you still have not kind of like, you know, private housing, but you have apartment housing, and where you know, the amenities are not that much. So basically people locate there because they can't afford living in the inner city. And that's the areas where people will be moving away from, because those who can afford, they'll be moving to the city center, and those who want to be in the countryside, they'll be moving out because they can telework. And I think I need to stop here. Thanks.
Thank you. That's really helpful. I want to invite Tim and Adam and others to also join in. Alexandra, you had indicated a couple of questions you wanted to respond to live. So why don't you start with those, and then we'll come over to some of the other colleagues to join in.
No, they were actually answered live, and it is how we remove them from the list.
Okay, great.
Yeah, because if I do it done, it goes off the list into the answered questions.
Okay, so we have a number of new questions, but let me ask Tim and Adam or Eckert if you would like to join in on any of the comments so far.
Yeah.
So there was a question that was directed at Jen, but I'll maybe have a first go at it. Sorry, Adam Brown, Cambridge Econometrics. Thank you for having me on today. So the question was about the possibility of developing policies which address both the COVID crisis and the ecological crisis, and how systems thinking might kind of help us think about that. So I think really when we think about these two crises, what we have is two kind of outcomes that we're trying to achieve. One is the recovery from the crisis. The other one is tackling the ecological and environmental emergency. And there's also this kind of set of factors that's hit us with the pandemic. And so there's one thing that's perhaps changed a lot of the systems. And so we have to think very carefully about what it is that will have changed amongst the relationships, the balancing and the feedback loops within the different subsystems, and work out how that's going to be slightly different now than it was maybe just a few years ago. And then think about trying to look for opportunities and try and use our kind of systems mapping, systems thinking methodology to look for opportunities that are complementary between tackling both the kind of the pandemic, the response to the pandemic, getting people back into jobs, getting people back into work, and also trying to identify ways in which we can do this in a way which helps with kind of sustainability as well. So, I mean, there's plenty kind of examples, but I mean, the most obvious one would be perhaps the potential, the move to remote work and how that will change some of the way some of our transport and agglomeration subsystems will play out over the next few decades, and the extent to which that offers us an opportunity to decarbonize our transport system through either kind of modal shift or demand reduction in terms of people actually moving to and from their workplace. Jen, did you want to come in on that one as well, seeing as it was addressed at you?
No, I think you nailed it there. I think, Tim, were you going to answer that question too, or did you have something else to say?
No, well, I suppose just picking up on the general theme, there's some really kind of interesting things, and Stefan's point and also Peter's point about here kind of how do we make sure that this just doesn't become hyperbole and we're not actually making a difference. And I think for me and the work that we're doing with kind of government departments and agencies, the norms and the ways of working that are established, I think people are wanting to challenge these now. We know that things aren't working and they're looking for those alternatives. And I think that is quite exciting, and it does provide an opportunity to rethink and do things differently. And coming on to kind of some of the points that perhaps Jill's raised in the chat there as well about innovation and productivity, and certainly the systems lens as applied to the R&D landscape in the UK and some of the challenges from that perspective, the work that we've been doing with Innovate UK. We know that there's a trade-off. Innovation isn't necessarily going to drive productivity. That's not at every stage. We see those inefficiencies, but it's the longer term game. And Jen mentioned this in the presentation about thinking about the different time frames and the different scales. And when we think about the leveling up agenda, and we also think about building back and how all this comes together, we can use this systems perspective. And I think that it's something that we are seeing more and more. And that desire to invoke and instill change within the policy environment, and actually that appetite is something that I think we'll see this become more and more popular. There's a desire to do things differently. And I think that Jen mentioned the use of tools in there and how we can instill these tools and embed them in the practice. And that's not to say it's easy, because I think there is a lot of kind of institutional resistance because of the way that things are done. And overcoming that is the next big challenge. But I think what we are seeing is that there is an appetite and recognition that the siloed approach may improve things in certain areas, but it limits. If we think about it as the radio dashboard, we can't turn all of the dials up. We need to understand the interdependence between them if we're going to get the best sound out at the end. So I think we are kind of increasingly seeing that as well. And maybe to the point that Kahar makes as well, it's trying to kind of think within that about the mechanisms that are in place. And I think that as a result of COVID, we have seen a variety of different mechanisms, both on the policy side, the responses, the programs and the interventions coming in that are different. And I think the exciting thing now is that the nature of some of those changes and those differences, they are not just a reactive mechanism to crisis, but they prove that things can be done differently. And it's about how we embed and we really kind of embrace those, adapt and improve them to deliver over the longer term, rather than seeing them as a kind of a short shift response.
Tim, thank you. It's great. Eckhard, several people referenced your comments. Did you want to jump in with a response or an observation?
No, thank you. Thanks.
Okay. Okay, so we have, I think, again, there are several questions here. Jill Bentley's question, Peter Austin has several questions that get at that core question. I'll use Peter's as an example. Question to Jen, do you see the possibility of developing real policies which address both COVID crisis and ecological crisis from systems thinking? What are examples? Earlier, Peter also posed a similarly direct question. He said, let me just go back to this for a second. He raised this question of sort of how do we actually do this? And I'm curious, who can speak to that? No one's mentioned yet the old Donella Meadows vision of points of leverage. I wonder if any of this work can help translate that classic 11 levels of leverage into Tim's point now, mechanisms. What does this look like in concrete policy areas? We have the example from Rudiger of innovation policy as a case. Can we begin to imagine other tough cases that would force us to go beyond saying systems thinking is good to talking about what systems thinking looks like in policy? Anybody want to grab any of those issues? Peter's questions, Jill's question, others on these? And we have just 2 minutes, so be concise.
All right. Well, I know Adam spoke a bit to Peter's question about
exactly the
COVID and ecological thing. Yeah, I mean, the thing about systems thinking is that, you know, I think of it in 2 different ways, right? And I think Tim was kind of getting at this, is that there's systems thinking, like broad principles, a philosophy, a way of looking at it that I think can be a practical application. And then there's systems methodologies. And actually, one of the things that that happens a lot, I think, in the policy field is that we can say big things about, you know, systems thinking, and like, yeah, we'll totally adopt that. And like, whenever you get in a room with people in government, they're like, yeah, of course, like that makes a lot of sense, because it does. Like, it's like not really rocket science, but how do you translate that, and like, what do you apply it to, is a whole other ballgame, and at what scale, right? And one of the things is that like Tim and I have highlighted in previous presentations is that adopting systems thinking actually works best kind of at smaller levels. Like, thinking about it nationally is just like, it's huge. It's like a huge thing. You've got it, there's value in it, but it's like, you can't map a whole national economy effectively. You can try. And that's where the methodologies come in, is that they kind of like take bits and pieces, the types of modeling that you can do, the types of mapping that you can do, the kinds of questions that you can ask, takes bits and pieces and tries to apply it to that. And I mentioned experimental governance and experimental policy as one of the places where you can sort of start to bring these things together. And that is in designing experimental interventions using systems, principles, and tools, and in kind of targeted places. And we know that works all right. It's been done many times. But what we think is really missing is this sort of linking up to a more meso or meta scale of applying it at government. I don't know if that answered the question, but
Great, Jen,
I don't know if my people want to jump in on that.
So just a quick question, Alexandra, I know we need to end the session. Can we stay on informally, or do we just end and disperse?
I think it's better to take a break. It's been a little bit long for some of the participants.
Okay.
But the questions are in the Q&A. All speakers are welcome to answer in writing.
Yeah.
They're still there. Actually, it is what I would encourage you to do if you can. So the questions will disappear and will not really confound the next session. But we do encourage you to stand up and take a little break.
Yeah, okay. So thank you very much, presenters, Jen and Rudiger. Great, thanks for the paper and the work and the colleagues. Many, many good questions. I think we've made a little headway. I think we still need to push to go from, as Jen said, the aspiration and potential of systems thinking and system methodologies to demonstrating use cases and practical policy initiatives. So there's more work to be done, as they say. Thank you very much, everyone. Have a good break.
Thank you. Welcome back, everyone. I think we are ready for our last session. I wonder how many of you really stepped away from your screens. The last session will be a lot about complexity, but also taking stock of all what's been said and what's going on today with productivity and all its building blocks. So it is my honor to welcome Lord Jim O'Neill, who will be moderating this session. He is an economist and former Treasury Minister in the Great Britain. He is known for many things, and among them, coining the term BRIC countries. So that's one of them. Lord Jim, the floor is yours. Welcome.
I was on the dreaded mute. Good afternoon. We're very short of time, so I won't take up too much with formal intros or me saying anything. Many of you will be pleased to know. I'll just say two things at the introduction. First of all, three things. I apologize, I could not join you until now. I'm in the middle of an exceptionally busy few days for various things I'm doing. Secondly, as I've just been joking in the chat box beforehand, it is exceptionally irritating, Alexandra, that you guys highlight the downsides to the current situation, because I'm sure many of you that had the pleasure of being at an event in Trento hosted by the OECD's office there is nothing quite like it in terms of beauty for an economics-based event out of tens of thousands that I must have participated in around the world over my many years. And it's making me feel pining for better days. And then the last thing is, over those many times, I have spent a staggering amount of time trying to understand so many aspects to productivity, and I'm still yet to find any particularly powerful solutions. So with that in mind, it's fabulous to preside over the panel, which, especially hearing what Alexandra said, to include some thoughts about what's been said earlier in the day. So with no further ado, I'm going to hand you over firstly to Igor and Benjamin, who are going to guide us through their piece for 15 minutes. Then secondly, my dear friend, Philip McCann. Then I have the pleasure of trying to host and chair some questions for 20 minutes. Assuming that our guests will stick to their time. I have noticed that you both have a lot of slides, so hopefully you're going to be very selective with them. So with that in mind, let me turn over to Igor if I can.
Thank you very much. Can I have my first slide? Yeah, so I was asked to talk about our work with NIAC, OECD NIAC, on resilience and efficiency. And I have to say I'm new in a productivity world, and I did a little bit of research. Our session is titled Productivity Paradox. So what I noticed is that even without COVID, the world of productivity has some problems. Productivity goes down. This is Eurozone. And you can see that despite all these technological advances, we clearly see a decline. And moreover, what is interesting, this is 2008 crisis, Lehman Brothers crisis, we have decline in productivity that is happening around the crisis. So I was following previous discussions here. Can I have next slide? What really kind of uneasy for me to realize that people are saying, well, everything is working well in normal, quote unquote, situation, but during the crisis, it doesn't seem to work. For me, it means that something fundamental in the way we measure productivity or discuss productivity may be wrong, because as a physicist in background, I like to have models that work. And if model doesn't work in crisis, that's something wrong with this model. And this is yet another evidence. This is post-COVID, or well, we're still in the COVID situation, post first wave of COVID information. You can see information that we actually, Ben and I, are working with on daily basis. We're part of COVID task force in New England. We support regional administrators, both for FEMA and Health and Human Services, in their decisions on economic development, health protection, and things like that. So you can see consumer spending now is back to whatever normal is, but it's similar what we had like 1 year ago before COVID. But with that, 40% of small businesses are closed. This is for state of Maine. So what does it tell you? That something wrong with the way one metrics reflects on another. And next slide was already discussed in greater details. I think the fundamental problem that we have in productivity field, as well as in economic modeling in general, and we work with NIAC extensively on that, is that we tend to look at component of the system rather than on the big system. And I'm really glad that we already, like, 2 sessions that we have focus on complex system and its relevance to productivity. That's great. I'm not going to dwell on it, but what I'm going to try to say is how you deal with that, how you analyze productivity as a system property, how you define system, how you measure productivity, and other system properties. Most of work that Ben and I did is actually on resilience, which is ability to recover from disruption. So next slide. In the context of complex system, we clearly see globalization. And this is just food supply chain in UK. You can see half of the food products in UK are imported. And all our supply chain depends on this global production. And next slide takes us in, next slide, takes us in what we're working now, vaccine supply chain, COVID vaccine supply chain. You can see from news media and from other sources, and we are deeply into that, that Pfizer was going to produce 4 times more than they ended up producing. At this point, the plans were to administer more vaccine, like, much more than that is already done. So all that a problem, you can say productivity problem, because of supply chain, because in planning, in designing this, we individual company tried to look at their own supply chain and make it efficient and lean, and not necessarily resilient, not necessarily able to go through the crisis or scale up production. Next slide. And the question that we're asking, and this is actually was made to Nature last month in collaboration with OECD, William Hines from NIAC. So how we can combine efficiency and productivity is, for me, very close to efficiency and resilience in post-COVID societies. Because to really have sustained production and increase productivity, you need to be able to deal with crises. So next slide is basically our vision for that. The real world is very complex. It's a very complex system. It has physical component, all these production facilities. It has cyber component, how we coordinate information flow. It has social component, all the people that make decision on one side and consumers of the product on the other. So somehow we need to model that. And for us, we need to use complex system modeling tool. We use network science because for us, all these are interconnected networks, and supply chain is a great example of that. But of course, other approaches are possible, agent-based modeling, probabilistic modeling, and it's all different from kind of equilibrium model that economists tend to use. And based on this interconnected set of models, you can assess management alternatives. And you can clearly visualize trade-offs across efficiency, which is enhancing one component of the model or several at a time, and resilience, which is more about how these components are connected, how topology of the network works. And that's kind of influence ultimate decision, whether it's regulatory decision or decision by individual companies. Next slide. And I'm going to briefly mention just two sets of tools that we practice. One of them is metrics-based. We use individual metrics of, in your case, productivity or resilience or efficiency. We can combine them in indices or dashboard. What I'm going to show in a couple of slides, we use decision analytics because for us, you need to capture system properties, not just individual metrics. I will show how we do that. And then I will briefly go through network science approaches that we implement. And yeah, we published a lot in all this discipline. I will be glad to share papers if you contact me or Ben after this event. Next slide. So what we start with is a notion of resilience matrix. Or you can have in a similar way productivity matrix. So we acknowledge that the world includes physical domain, cyber, cognitive, and social. Those are system domains. And then if you click one more, you have this cycle of evolution of the system before and after crisis. So the system needs to be able to prepare for crisis when something bad happens, absorb threats, recover, and adapt. So what you have now is basically a matrix of 16 cells. And if you have individual metrics and combine them based on the importance of each individual cycle of resilience or productivity and domain, you will get this utility as an output associated with different courses of actions. Next slide. And indeed, this is what is happening in the corporate world. This is from Biogen. They use this individual metrics in a way that define their resilience for natural disaster. In this case, you have company ResiLink that provides services on tracing performance of suppliers. So these metrics-based approaches are implemented in a way to increase efficiency and resilience of individual companies. Next slide is more about, okay, but in the vaccine, think about that. We, as a government, we are not interested in Pfizer getting ahead of Moderna and others and produce more vaccine. We like to support all vaccine producers, and maybe all of them using the same suppliers. And it's not obvious which suppliers will be problematic, because each company has their own supply chain, but at the lower level of suppliers, they may be overlapping. So then the question is how you build network, how you understand network property of supply chain. Next slide. What we've done, we try to define resilience as a network property of the system. And unfortunately, I cannot say much about productivity, but we look at efficiency and resilience of transportation network. So efficiency, or you can say productivity of transportation network, is ability to get you through cities from one point to another without traffic. But resilience is extra time that you spend in traffic after unknown or unexpected accident. Maybe it's snowstorm, maybe it's bad accident, maybe it's cyber attack on lights or something of that kind. So next slide shows how we've done that. We connect resilience model that traces all this extra delay, and then we connect it with regional economic modeling model Transite that tells you how much of economic impact these delays cause on GDP. So next slide shows when you do that, you can really see difference in efficiency and resilience in multiple cities. We use 40 cities in the US, and you can see that some of them are efficient, like Los Angeles, efficient like smaller cities, like Cleveland, Cincinnati, Memphis, and they also resilient comparatively. But some are efficient but not resilient, like Los Angeles, inefficient but not resilient, efficient but not resilient like Los Angeles, and some of them not efficient and not resilient like San Francisco. But San Francisco and LA has more or less the same inefficiency, a lot of traffic. But why in the world LA is so efficient and San Francisco is so inefficient? The answer is basically topology of the network. In LA, you have a regular grid of street, many small roads. In San Francisco, you have bridges, you have stretches of the highway. So if something happened in San Francisco, you're likely to be stuck on a bridge. You cannot escape. In LA, you always find a small street to go around. So similarly, you can think about productivity that in some cases, when you have crisis, some companies has ability to switch to something else, to have means of getting their bottom lines through other production mode or consumer population and things like that. So next slide. Obviously, all this inefficiency and lack of resilience has impact on GDP. We calculated for different cities, and you see that if you use normal equilibrium models, normal equilibrium economic models that what Remy uses in their daily practice, you get much less of impact than if you really integrate a resilience model. And it's highly nonlinear. I have no time to go into that, but this is a long way to say that you just cannot use equilibrium model for crisis, and that's what already was discussed. This is quantitative modeling support for that thesis. Next slide. What is interesting, we see the difference in big cities and small cities, cities that produce a lot, like Seattle, versus cities that produce a little, some Midwest cities, and rich cities and big cities tend to be less resilient. So again, no time to go through that. Next slide. So why it's important? Because improving in efficiency and in resilience and in productivity is achieved by different means. If you like to improve efficiency, you can just have more of your top products, more of your best sellers. But from resilience point of view, that's misleading. If your top product is knocked down by crisis, you have no other means to sustain your bottom line. So resilience would require parallel production. So obviously you see immediate trade-offs. And we argue that quantitative evaluation is required to assess this trade-off and make the best policy decision. Next slide. So in summary, system approach is necessary. I try to go through metric-based and network science tools. I will be glad to share papers, and we need to approach productivity, efficiency, and resilience in a different way. So I will stop here. I have to join another meeting in 15 minutes, but Ben Trump will be part of discussions, and he will be answering all the questions. Thank you.
Igor, thank you very much. What a fascinating set of slides you showed us. As I joked earlier, partially, I've sat through and contributed to endless productivity discussions over the years, but you bring a whole new approach to it. So thank you very much just for that. And I cannot resist in saying that it was rather amusing to see San Francisco in the bottom left-hand quadrant, where most of the world spends most of its time thinking that's where all the technology-based productivity is coming from. Highly amusing, and no doubt something to pursue. But we look forward to Ben joining the discussion. Let me quickly turn straight over to Philip, and hope Philip, you're looking as in good a form as that wonderful picture of you on the screen is showing.
Hi, yes, I don't know where that photograph came from. It's about 10 or 12 years ago, I think, Jim. So I'm flattered that somebody thinks I look anything like that, but I'll try to be a bit more realistic. I'll have to update the OECD with a photograph which is more or less contemporary, I think.
I know for sure that that's what you still look like normally. It's just the personal stress of dealing with being on Zoom all the time.
Yes. I'd like to say it's what I feel like, but whether that's true or not is different.
Anyhow, over to you.
Okay, thank you very much indeed, Jim. Okay, well, I'll go straight in. So, Alexandra, can we go straight onto my first slide? So what I'm thinking about is the productivity shocks that many of our cities and regions are facing, and now in the context of coronavirus. So the two books which have been produced so far by the Productivity Insights Network, which include a lot of the presenters on today's meeting. The first book, which was Productivity Perspectives, we were looking at all different ways of thinking about the productivity problems, productivity puzzles that many places face. And then the new book, Productivity in the Pandemic, of course, is trying to say in what ways has what's happened in the last 11 or 12 months, in what ways is that changing anything, shifting, accelerating, and so on. So one of the ways to think about it, and all of the things I'm just going to say now are all in the book chapter that I co-authored with Raquel Ortega-Arguelles. Think about the difference here and behind the frontier firms. So you've got the kind of leading tech players in any sector, services, manufacturing, and you've got laggards. The question is, to what extent is productivity and productivity performance dependent or driven by these distributions of leading versus laggard firms? Or in some language, we talk about the long tail, kind of a long tail of lower productivity firms versus a core of high productivity firms, many of which tend to be new technology entrepreneurial firms and multinationals, multi-plant firms. There are lots of discussions in this area, and actually what's interesting is the discussions are much less straightforward than one might think. It's not necessarily the shocks of things like coronavirus. It's not necessarily that the more productive firms come out of this well and the weaker firms are the ones which face the shocks. A lot of evidence now saying it's a much more mixed picture than that. It depends on the context, it depends on the industry, it depends on the technology field. In the UK, there's a huge discussion now around leveling up, which is all about basically trying to promote or foster interregional convergence. As many of you know, the UK has very, very high interregional inequalities in terms of productivity and on many indicators prosperity. So there's a big priority theme across government now to try and so-called level up. In economics language, we're talking about interregional convergence. But of course, this was predating the crisis. Then suddenly the crisis comes And in some sense, all bets are off because the scale of the economy-wide shutdowns, disruption to global value chains, we've got tremendous shocks in certain sectors such as hospitality, travel, tourism, the automobile industry, kind of high street retail. These are industries which have taken enormous hits, and also certain areas of the job market, graduates and school leavers, those job markets are almost frozen at the moment. Actually, there's some new research that just came out in the last day or two that also says the over 50s job market is collapsing. People have been made redundant by the crisis. Those people are finding it extremely hard to get back into the job market. So if we can go on to the next slide, please. One of the things that we know is going to happen in almost every country is that there's bigger government deficits and government debt positions. That's just a reality of how governments have had to respond. And part of that is that governments have had to intervene, in a sense, almost take over many parts of the economy in ways that really hasn't happened in our lifetime, certainly not outside of a wartime situation. We see this in the UK, we see this in many, many countries. So one of the issues is the relationship between national and subnational governments on many levels, legal levels, fiscal, financial. Those issues are going to be changed in every country. At the moment, we're kind of in a frozen state because so many countries still have kind of full or partial lockdowns, a lot of public support for people who are working, furlough type schemes. But once these start to unwind, those fiscal and financial positions between central and local government are going to change dramatically, as well as issues like unemployment, insolvencies, and so on starting to arise. Now, in the UK context, as I say, we've got these very large interregional differences. Andy Haldane, chief economist of the Bank of England, described the UK economy as a hub with no spokes. And what he was meaning was you've got huge differences between broadly the core of the economy, let's say London, its very broad hinterland, and other regions. And also at a sectoral level between the leading firms and the laggard firms, those linkages don't seem to disseminate knowledge, best practice, the development, the dissemination, the diffusion of these things doesn't seem to work in the way that we might expect it to from fairly general textbook type of arguments. There's a very nice paper, well, the book by Jonathan Haskell and Stian Westlake, which talks about the 4 S's. The modern economy is dominated by 4 S's. This is thinking about the modern economy, which is knowledge-driven, intangibles-driven economy. The features of the kind of intangible economy, huge sunk costs, and they also tend to be scalable. And what's happening is you're trying to drive synergies and spillovers. Now, if you think in terms of sunk costs and synergies and spillovers, it's possible to think that sunk costs and scalable are things that tend to concentrate in localities and also in particular firms or organizations. So tend to lead to the monopoly or monopsony positions and also growth in very particular localities, let's say the Silicon Valley type observation. Whereas synergies and spillovers can also generate diffusion effects. They could lead to concentration, could be very localized or within certain groups of companies or in certain groups of places or neighborhoods, but also they could generate diffusion. How do we translate the knowledge economy from one which is all about concentration to one which is all about decentralization and spread effects? That's really a challenge that we're struggling with. And the whole kind of IT, digitalization, teleworking, all of this was part of that discussion long before the crisis. How do these technological changes change these things? Also changes in the structure and the operation of financial markets, venture capital, different types of banking, financial, different types of markets, private equity, and so on. How did they change those distributions? If we can go on to the next slide, please. But of course, the crisis has meant that we were in, if you like, the ordinary times where investors, they try to price risk, they try to put numbers, they look at distributions, and they place bets on those on the basis of that evidence, to a situation where we had a period of several months where the markets basically stopped to all intents and purposes, particularly certain markets, because it was almost impossible to price things. The same thing happened back in the global financial crisis, although the reasons and the causes of that were very different to what's happened this last year. But still, when you get a shock What it means is that investors' expectations moving forward are very weakly grounded. And we've had so many different descriptions about how our economies might recover: a V-shaped, a Nike swoosh striped shaped recovery, a Z-shaped, W-shaped, U-shaped, L-shaped, as we heard from Eckhard Ernst this morning and others. There's also a possibility of a K-shaped recovery, where different parts of the economy effectively partition and segment into different growth trajectories. We don't know the answer, and investors, you can see this in the behavior of markets, are moving up and down all over the place at the moment. Markets still, their expectations are weakly grounded. What we do know, of course, is the scale of the scarring depends on how long it's going to take to not only develop the vaccines we're developing, but actually implement them. So the development of vaccines includes vaccinating people. It's not just the scientific leverage, it's also the actual dissemination and public intervention. Next slide, please. There are lots of discussions about restructuring of trade and local investment patterns, particularly around new technologies, things like automation, the Internet of Things, artificial intelligence, 3D printing, and so on, which says that, well, there are possibilities that the general patterns toward global value chains, we could see some sort of nearshoring of activity. So reconfiguring what goes on in cities and regions back to something prior to, let's say, the late 1980s, early 1990s. That's possible, but it's a conjecture. We don't really know about that, other than the point that our ability to do that also depends on our existing trade structures. We can't reinvent the wheel on some of these things. And certain types of firms and regions are better integrated in global value chains. And many people argue, actually, the more integrated you are, the better you will respond post-crisis. You're more resilient. You've got more resources and knowledge to draw from. Next slide, please. But one of the issues that I've been focused on, I've been talking with Jim about this quite recently, actually, is one of the things that we know happened in the last financial crisis was the uncertainty led to a widening of yield spreads in terms of risks, both within asset classes and between them, within sectors and between sectors. And my concern would be that something like this will happen again. Now, we have seen this in particularly two areas already. There's a lot of evidence emerging of major capital withdrawal, particularly in the real estate industry, obviously related to the cause of cities, but real estate in general, and also SME markets. And basically, the argument here is that because a lot of companies which are big have been downgraded in terms of their investment profile, that their access to finance through the normal money market routes that they would normally operate with have actually been restricted. So they're then having to de facto rely on bank funding in a situation where normally they wouldn't do that. So de jure they have unlimited bank access, but de facto they don't use it, whereas now they are doing that. And what that does then is it squeezes a lot of the smaller companies, so that the smaller companies are likely to be squeezed, one, because of a general reduction of credit, and two, from this top-down pressure from many of the bigger companies being downgraded. And there is a lot of evidence coming out, particularly in the Financial Times and The Economist, of these types of mechanisms happening. This is my kind of conjecture. I mean, there are other arguments of saying there's a great deal of interest in bond markets at the moment, a huge expansion and recovery in bond markets, including corporate bonds. But again, that tends to favor certain types of industries, particularly larger firms in more monopoly and monopsony positions would mirror the more monopoly and monopsony positions of central government as well. So the issue here is to what extent the financial crisis associated with the pandemic is also going to lead to these capital reallocation effects. My guess is it's likely to lead to more concentration of monopoly positions, which are also reflected spatially. If we can move forward on the slides, please. There will be a few sectors which seem to be doing reasonably well. Certain areas of private equity, for example, seem to be looking around at new opportunities and so on. In terms, if you read due diligence sections of the Financial Times, you see this every day. But still, I think the SME industries and the real estate industries are likely to be right in the eye of the storm here. And that's very important because they are such important players in the growth of our localities, the growth of cities and regions, building those local entrepreneurial ecosystems, a lot of which are leveraged on real estate markets. In fact, real estate collateral is the largest form of collateral for most small firms. So the kind of potential weakening of the local entrepreneurship drivers of the innovation economy in many cities and regions is an area that I am very concerned about. Even in real estate markets, I mean, there was a period of complete closure and suspension of real estate investment trusts. Even today, it's very hard to value a lot of these assets. And there's a paper just published by Nick Bloom that Paolo Veneri, who's in this meeting, just alerted to me today, which shows you see marked shifts in real estate values within US cities. So core areas of cities, big falls in real estate values, and the growth is tending to be out on the edges of the big US cities as people who potentially can start shifting to relatively more home working are willing to move out to the edge of the cities. Now, of course, European cities in spatial terms tend to be much smaller than North American cities. But these kind of shifts, I think, are going to be more prevalent. We're going to see some of these kind of relocation type behavior. I think the nervousness that many market makers will have may mean a shift to more land banking rather than development in the short term, simply because infrastructure and real estate development are medium and long term by definition. And so my guess is that yields in these areas are more likely to rise in more risky contexts, smaller places, weaker economies. That would be my guess what the major risk is, at least in terms of spatial issues. If we can jump on to the next slide, I think I've got 2 more slides left. And this was what we saw in the 2008 crisis. Paolo Veneri and I and a couple of other colleagues have actually published a paper on this recently that I've had a conversation with Jim about. Where does this leave our countries? Well, I think at the moment, most of the evidence is pointing towards greater concentration and centralization rather than diffusion, from the point of view that central government is going to be in a more important, more kind of steering role post-crisis than a lot of subnational government positions, simply because of the fiscal effects. If there is a widening of spreads across regions, which is my bet what will happen, then that will imply a greater differences in the ability of different places to recover from the shocks. And in particular, because a lot of the places which tend to be more centralized and less risky are also the places where higher proportions of the local workforce are able to telework, either totally through the crisis or partially home working as we come out of the crisis. So it seems to me that a lot of these things are pushing in the same direction. If I just go to my last slide. It's clear that there will be some sort of reduction in commuting frequencies. I think Anne Green mentioned this earlier, it's like a natural experiment. What's happened, the shock. And I think this is something that's going to happen worldwide, but it doesn't mean people will not go to core cities and regions. It just means the optimal frequency of commuting will fall. That would tell us that bid rent curves will become flatter. So cities and commuting hinterlands will tend to spread out. As I say, the Nick Bloom paper is already showing this in the United States. In countries like the UK, Netherlands, Germany, where we have very strict planning systems, so there are land price constraints. My guess is you'll just get greater commuting across the kind of planning limits of cities, and so the places that are likely to benefit would be smaller towns and neighborhoods in the hinterland areas of prosperous cities. Actually will probably come out of this very strongly. And actually, from the core city point of view, if I think of someone like London, actually it's an argument to suggest London's agglomeration effect could actually be even stronger, because you'd get better matching over a bigger hinterland area. Manchester vis the other parts of the north of England. Obviously, there's lots of different elements in this jigsaw, but those are the kind of things I'm thinking about. We know there's going to be reconfiguring and redesign of a lot of center city workspaces, and there's big evidence now of shifts of commercial properties being shifted into residential and industrial properties, and more mixed use than previously was the case. University cities are going to be in a difficult position. We know that until the university systems in general can get back on their feet in many countries. And my final point is, I would have a concern about the movement towards the Paris Agreement Sustainable Development Goals. That the shocks that most countries have faced, my guess is a lot of those goals will go on the back burner for the next few years. That would be a pessimistic view, and I'm not too optimistic view would be this is the perfect time to build back better. I agree. But the reality of political economy is most countries' governments are just will just want to get people back in work as fast as possible and as many as possible. And my concern would be that the movement that we were seeing in terms of the SDGs will probably be well, more or less truncated, at least for several years. And that indeed is the Secretary General of the United Nations has exactly the same concerns. So I think I'll stop there, Jim. I think that I'll just finish.
Okay, thank you very much, Philip. Also very interesting. We have about 15 minutes for me to preside over questions. So actually, I'm going to kick off myself deliberately contentiously, because there's aspects of what you both raised that I don't really agree with. But, you know, that's the point of events like this. But particularly yours, Philip, you sort of virtually everything you said lent to a negative consequence of both before and since the crisis. But as you and I have chatted about, but this is a question for both you and Ben, really. Surely, in the spirit of never waste, both by what you touched about, Philip, on widening credit spreads, that will do the job of helping improve productivity, because amongst other things, it's going to stop the scale of highly leveraged real estate participation going on. In fact, and you do see evidence of that already in credit markets. And to me, that's a good thing. And similarly with it, to the particularly dominant for, I'm sure many in the audience know, the issue of so-called levelling up in the UK. Quite ironically and bizarrely, actually, this might be doing more wonders for levelling up than anything anybody could have dreamt of in the past 20 years. And there's, each week that goes by, there's more and more evidence of that, in my view, both out of London, but also, interestingly, between other parts of the country. For you, Ben, and it comes also to one of the questions which I think Alison Weingarten put into the chat box. Amongst other things, I am immersed in the whole international health issue, including many aspects of what's going on right now on vaccines. And I would put it to you that the speed at which pharmaceutical companies have responded to this, including their collaboration, that we see more and more evidence by the day, this might be also the source of a permanent boost to real productivity amongst pharmaceutical firms, and for completely breaking this peculiar protectionist policy around trials. And we might be in the early stages of permanently reducing the time it takes to develop vaccines. What do you both think about that as I accumulate some of the questions? I'll start with you, Philip.
Okay, thanks, Jim. Well, as I indicated when I was speaking, you and I have been talking about these things in a lot over recent weeks, including where we agree and where we disagree. Yes, I think the widening of credit spreads, I think you're right. One of the effects of that will be to reduce potentially some of the leveraging, where development has been highly leveraged. The difficulty is, my guess is that that will tend to favor certain types of places rather than others. That would be my guess. But I'm looking on the evidence in terms of what we found from the previous global financial crisis. You can argue, of course, that they're quite different shocks, and it may be that we don't get the spread in yields, although the early evidence coming out suggests it is happening. So it could lead to less leverage and, in some sense, more careful development processes. If I take the case of the UK, for example, over-leveraged development in real estate hasn't been a major problem in the UK in terms of the levelling up issues, but in Spain it's been a catastrophe. I mean, Spain's post-crisis shocks were primarily related to over-leveraging in real estate markets here, and local government had gone into a lot of development processes in conjunction with private investors, extremely highly leveraged, just basically optimism bias was driving everything. And when the crisis came, cities like Valencia, for example, I know because the OECD had done a lot of work on this, you know, these places were struggling to try and get out of these debt positions. You know, slowly they've managed to kind of turn these things around, but it's taken a long time. We saw the same thing in the Republic of Ireland as well, as you well know, in Dublin. In the weaker parts of the UK, the Midlands and the north of England, my impression is that that hasn't been a big problem. The problem was more in some cities, actually getting financing in the first place was more of a problem. A lot of the over leveraging tended to be more prosperous places, particularly in London. That's my impression. I may be wrong, in which case you can correct me on that. I think the productivity point is actually quite important here. You're right, because it may lead to more realistic capital allocations in terms of productivity, and the underlying drivers of productivity, absolutely correct. And I think the other element, which links to your point about pharma, the kind of natural experiment shock that's happened, you know, what we're doing now, we're talking, you know, we're both in the UK talking to each other in different parts of the country with another 100 people in the room who are from all over the world. I think also that is forcing companies to massively rethink their structures, their organizational routines. In fact, I know of many companies which are already doing that. They're trying to rethink who needs to be where to do what at what time. You know, the idea of large office floor space for big companies, this is disappearing tremendously quickly. A lot of companies are offsetting floor space because they don't need 200 people in an office every day now. They can rationalize operations. So I think there's going to be an efficiency gain associated with that, because companies have been really forced to rethink very carefully who needs to do what and where each time, and what role can technology play in terms of those restructuring possibilities. So for a city like Manchester in the north of England, this does offer real possibilities. There's no question that many activities which at the moment take place in London actually could quite happily take place in Manchester now, with executives from Manchester maybe heading down on the train once a week or something. Suddenly those things become much more realistic because we've had to learn how to do these things. So I think this interface between the shock and the adoption and use of new technology is going to be something which is very much up in the air. I guess what I would like is, you know, are those shocks going to favour Sheffield as well as Manchester or Birmingham? That's a difficult one. I think there might be a reordering of the relative positions of not just the cities at the top of the hierarchy, but actually as you move down the hierarchy, there might be some reconfiguration there. And that's something that we'll be looking for in the next year or two.
Okay, thank you very much. There's so many other issues that I could come back on related to all of this, but we don't have time. Ben, let's turn to you. And also, in addition to answering my point to you, Helen Mulligan writes that you talked about the size of cities, or IGA did, about having an impact on their resilience. Could you briefly touch on that? And we only sadly have 5 minutes left, guys.
Sure, I'll be very quick, and thanks for your questions. So first, looking at the pharma structure. So I'm a public health PhD by trade. So one, I'm fascinated by all the discussion that's going on, but I'm coming from a bit of a different angle. When you're looking at the risk governance of the pharmaceutical sector and responding to an emergency, the grossest way to simplify production, the vaccine development and distribution processes, we've got 3 steps where we can be deriving greater returns on efficiency. 1 is research and development, 2 is manufacturing, and 3 is distribution. And all 3 are, of course, heavily regulated. They're heavily governed by very extensive risk assessment tests and assays. And across all of this, this is a very purposeful system that by and large has done well, albeit it does occasionally slow down the development of certain drugs, vaccines, and other therapeutics. So what you're going to be seeing, so I would say to your question of, are we going to see more benefit? Are we going to see more efficiencies, even temporarily, from increased public-private partnership and other innovations here? Yes, with a caveat. On the research and development side, there's been a lot of interest in engaging and jumping into new technologies related to therapeutic development and vaccine development, such as mRNA-based technologies. before, again, this is not a terribly new technology. It's been studied quite a bit, but it hasn't been deployed because there hasn't been a catalyst for it. And we're starting to see that, of course, not all vaccine candidates are using this technology, certainly, and not even most, but there is an increased willingness to at least look more into this. It's very promising because there are many treatments that can be derived from this to scale very quickly, and rather than in a production scale of months, you're talking about weeks. And so there's a lot of benefit to be derived there. That being said, when you're talking about public-private partnership, one of the big benefits with these national efforts to develop COVID-related vaccines was a very much a concentrated effort where all eyeballs, all funding, all attention was placed on a very narrow subset of development. And within this, as this goes away, it's some of the alignment related to helping some of our pharma companies through their clinical trials and their innovative valley of death. That necessarily isn't going to remain as much. There certainly will be improvements, but we won't necessarily see like such a willingness to go through regulatory hurdles as quickly going forward. And in some cases, maybe, and that isn't necessarily a bad thing for some diseases where they are not necessarily well characterized. There's a lot of health-based concerns to hash out through hazard assessment and general toxicology. Having some of these regulatory checks is very much a good thing. And there are some efficiencies there, but we need to be looking closer into that. And so, and please, could you repeat your second question very quickly?
No time to discuss any of this, but I personally think there is going to be some policy initiatives to try and make sure that the regulatory approval process, as well as the trial process going forward, might be done more permanently in a way as a result of this crisis, but time will tell. The second question was actually about, you guys seem to emphasize about or imply that the bigger a city, the less resilient they are. Is that exactly what you meant, or is it more nuanced?
It's more nuanced than that. I mean, at the end of the day, it's the question is the scale of complexity within a city. So you can have small cities that are very, very complex, or large cities that are relatively simplified. This is both within their infrastructure setup, the different socioeconomic patterns that you see, how people get to and from work, the types of activities and cultural, behavioral, just biological practices that they're participated in even just like the broader environmental and infrastructural setup. Like you made a joke about San Francisco. The big challenge with San Francisco is it's a city of bridges. And when these bridges shut down, it doesn't matter what kind of reworking that you can have in your local transport system or your local economic system. The city just shuts down for at least flows of population traffic. So it's all about how complex you are. And as you become more complex, is your system able to accommodate disruption in a way that it can quickly recover from and adapt to severed links or lost nodes, so that flows of income, flows of capital, flows of goods and people are able to reorient with minimal delay and minimal permanent loss? If the answer is that losses are going to be permanent or there's significant disruption, well, then you have a challenge. And that's where we need to be starting to look of investing in resilience, both from the top down as well as the bottom up.
Very good, thank you. Well, we've come to the end of our time already. I have to say on that, by coincidence, 2 days ago, I listened to a extremely interesting discussion with a New York-based, very imaginative specialist on urban land that argues traditional real estate people have got absolutely no chance of understanding what's going to happen with real estate, and the whole interplay with technology and content of any form of real estate, whether it's office or otherwise, is the key, especially as it relates to how one place benefits or suffers relative to another, which I encourage Alexandra, you guys to have an event just on that on Trento, ideally sometime around early summer or late August, as you often do, and I will certainly put my name down for that. So
yes.
with that in mind, thank you very much for inviting me to host this far too short session. There's so many hundreds of issues I'd love to discuss more, and I think I'm going to either turn it back to you or to Philip, who's going to sum up of the day, I believe. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jim, and I should say I always really enjoy and value our conversations. I have to say, in terms of our Productivity Insights network over the last 3 years, probably the part of the network that I've really enjoyed the most are the meetings of our International Advisory Board that Jim chairs. Eckhard Ernst, who presented earlier, is one of our board members. Joachim Oliveira Martins, another one. Tony Venables. They're just great meetings because you really throw out all these difficult problems and you're able to have conversations where you're not representing a particular industry, you're not advocating for a particular institution or even a way of thinking about something. You're just trying to understand and thrash out ideas on things which are very complicated. And it's probably been for me, the most enjoyable part of our work are those meetings. And it reminds me of Krugman's aphorism, productivity isn't everything. Just in the long run, it's almost everything. This was back in his 1995 book, The Age of Diminished Expectations. Why we always think that it's quite strange that the book was published in 1995, The Age of Diminished Expectations, when globalization was roaring ahead. What would the book be called today if he had to rewrite it today? If 1994, 1995 was Diminished Expectations, I don't know what today would be. But his general aphorism, this point about productivity isn't everything, just in the long run, it's almost everything. I actually think it's true also on a level that we don't really consider, in the sense that productivity is so difficult to understand because almost everything does contribute to it. And we've seen that in the discussions today, the issues that have just been brought up by Jim and the other chairs, the questions in the chat box, the questions which have been posed all through the day. Productivity really is one of what we call a wicked problem. Social scientists call a wicked problem. There are so many different moving parts, and to think about one aspect of productivity, you also have to think about all these other aspects at the same time. That makes it extraordinarily difficult to think about. But on the other hand, as we know, any societal goals, any of the big issues, productivity, innovation, well-being, health, and now, of course, the health-related pandemic and emergency, none of these things can be understood by a simple model from a particular field or a particular subfield. The world isn't like that. That's how academics and scholars tend to think. We understand that. But the difficult part is bringing people together who have different insights, different ways of thinking about something, different ways of framing a question, and then having those conversations. And it's the only way forward, it seems to me. And that's why these kind of meetings such as today are just so important. I think going back to Anne Green's comment, this shock that we've faced this last year really is a natural experiment. It is the right way to think about it. And we're going to see, it's like throwing everything up in the air and just seeing where things land on the ground. We're going to have to see what happens, but we're also trying to think through in advance ways forward. And the ways forward that we're thinking about, and you hear people talking about build back better, these kind of phrases, are really about thinking from a societal point of view, rather than just how individuals operate in some sort of atomistic, individualistic sense, but how do societies move forward in a more constructive, more positive manner. Of course, that is very, very difficult, thinking about institutions and governance and politics and so on. But I think it also relates to the question in the chat box by Rudiger and about, she's saying, well, instead of waiting for the market to produce vaccines, shouldn't society go into a kind of a mobilization economy with respect to vaccine production? Actually, I think the answer is yes. And I think that actually work on things like pharmaceuticals, such as paracetamol, for example. There are actually a very small number of places producing paracetamol, but this is actually typical of many parts of the pharmaceuticals industry. The whole global supply is reliant on a very small number of producers, where the marginal benefits of production are kind of close to zero. They're asymptotically zero. They're very generic. And of course, anything that becomes generic is always the problem of not being able to generate supernormal profits, and therefore companies don't invest. And actually, this is a more general problem. And I think lots of societies now, facing what's happened with the crisis, are thinking, actually, we cannot just leave these to market solutions. There has to be a much more serious conversation and joined up activities between governments, either individual governments or groups of governments together, and market investors and producers. I would hope this also is not just doesn't just operate and develop in the health-related area. You know, I think this is the hope that we do have in terms of the Paris Climate Accord, is that also this way of thinking about things will also heavily move into the sustainability and the climate change mitigation agenda. That's what I would hope would be the case. Whether that's going to be the case, I don't know. I am concerned that things may be delayed, as I've said. But anyway, rethinking productivity, you know, as Krugman was right, it's almost everything. The problem is almost everything is an explainer, is an explanatory in terms of productivity itself. So it makes the conversations extremely difficult. But what it does also do is heighten the urgency of why we have to think about these things. And I think particularly the work of both PIN and the Trento Centre, the team that Alexandra and her team are working on, is that spatial productivity is central to it now. And we have a general worldwide understanding that location, regions, cities matter in a way that probably 10 years ago we didn't really understand. And certainly in the UK, Jim has been the lead advocate of that way of thinking. So I'll stop there, Alexandra.
Thank you, Philip. Thank you, everyone. I think that concludes our meeting. It's amazing. It was such a long one. We didn't have enough time to discuss, so it is short and it is long. A few questions were not answered. I do apologize to attendees who asked them. We will try to follow as much as possible, at least sharing papers. The request will be forwarded to the experts, and I hope they will be able to share their work. Special thanks to attendees who are still with us. That's the resilience. Stay tuned to the outputs of the Spatial Productivity Lab, but also the Productivity Insights Network and Productivity Institute going forward. Goodbye.
Thank you.